Throughout history, there are moments that refuse to make sense, events documented, witnessed, recorded, yet never fully explained. Tonight, we step into the shadows where reason falters, a missing treasure with no trace, a lost capital of an entire civilization, mysterious people with no clear identity. These aren't legends passed down by firelight. They're real cases, real records, real silence where answers should be. Over the next 3 hours, we'll walk through the evidence, the timelines, and the questions that still haunt historians today. So sit back, relax, and let's dive in. The road climbs slowly here, threading through a high valley where the air thins and the wind never quite stops. Snow clings to the upper ridges even in summer, and the ground is littered with loose stone, slabs, boulders, fragments of something that might once have been shaped by human hands, or might never have been shaped at all. Somewhere in this stretch of mountains, ancient travelers said, stood a structure unlike any other on the road between two worlds. They called it the Stone Tower. The reference comes from Ptolemy's geography, written in the 2nd century AD, drawing on an earlier account by the geographer Marinus of Tyre. According to that account, a merchant named Maes Titianus, or agents working on his behalf, traveled the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to the distant land the Greeks called Serica, the source of silk. Along this route, roughly at its midpoint, lay a place marked simply as the Stone Tower, a waypoint where traders from the west exchanged goods with traders from the east, neither group traveling the full distance themselves. For centuries, scholars have tried to place this tower on a map. The name itself, Lithinos Pergos in Greek, suggests something man-made, perhaps a fortified outpost or a marketplace enclosed by stone walls. Some researchers point to Tashkurgan, a name that still survives in western China and translates fittingly to stone fortress. Others argue for sites further west, in the Alai Valley of present-day Kyrgyzstan, near a settlement called Darut Kurgan, where ancient ruins and caravan routes converge. Still others suggest the tower may have stood closer to Osh, or even further north, somewhere along the approaches to the Tarim Basin. The trouble is that Ptolemy's coordinates, however precise they appear on the page, were built from estimates of travel time and distance, numbers that compound their errors over thousands of kilometers. By the time the figures reach Central Asia, the margin for error spans an area larger than some countries. So which ruin, if any, is the real one? Or did the name simply move with the trade, attached to whichever fortified way station happened to mark the frontier of a given era? No archaeological site has been definitively confirmed as the Stone Tower. Excavations in the region have uncovered caravanserais, watchtowers, and fortified trading posts dating to roughly the right period. But nothing bearing an inscription, a marker, anything that says, "This is the place the old geographers meant." Local oral traditions in parts of the Pamir and Alai Mountains speak of towers built by ancient kings to watch the roads, and of stone structures that travelers once used as meeting points, but that were later abandoned, buried, or simply forgotten as the routes shifted. A few researchers have gone further, suggesting that the tower wasn't a single building at all, that it may have referred to a natural rock formation, a landmark so distinctive that merchants used it as a meeting point long before anyone built anything beside it. If that's true, the tower may still be standing, unnamed, indistinguishable from 1,000 other outcrops in a landscape that has changed little in 2,000 years. Somewhere between the Pamirs and the Tarim Basin, then, the place ancient merchants once agreed to call the Stone Tower either still exists, lies buried, or never existed as a single place at all. The maps point toward it, the texts describe it, but the mountains, so far, have kept their own record and have not yet chosen to share it. Before moving to the next mystery, if you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. If the mountains of Central Asia hold their secrets in ice and silence, the deserts further west hold theirs in sand, shifting, burying, and occasionally, just occasionally, giving something back. Picture a landscape of bare rock and rippling dunes, broken here and there by the remains of something built with purpose. Stone walls half swallowed by sand, and beneath them, a network of underground channels stretching for kilometers, carved by hand through solid rock. This is the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya, and the ruins belong to Garama, capital of a civilization the Romans called the Garamantes. For centuries, this kingdom thrived in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, sustained by an engineering feat that modern archaeologists are still mapping. A vast system of tunnels, known as fogaras, that drew water from underground aquifers and carried it across the desert to irrigate fields that, by all logic, should never have existed. The Romans knew the Garamantes well, first as adversaries, later as trading partners. In 19 BC, a Roman general named Cornelius Balbus led a campaign deep into the desert and reportedly reached Garama itself. A journey significant enough that Balbus was awarded a triumph in Rome, one of the last ever granted to someone outside the imperial family. From that point on, the Sahara was no longer simply an edge on the map. It was a place Rome had touched. But it's what happened afterward that becomes harder to pin down. Roughly a century later, the geographer Ptolemy, drawing once again on the work of Marinus of Tyre, the same source behind the accounts of the stone tower far to the east, recorded 2 expeditions that pushed even further south, beyond Garama, into territory no Roman text had described before. The first was led by a man named Septimius Flaccus, who, according to the account, marched south from the land of the Garamantes for 3 months until he reached the territory of a people Ptolemy calls Ethiopians, a term ancient writers used broadly for populations living south of the desert, without much precision about who, exactly, they were. The second expedition was led by Julius Maternus, who traveled alongside the king of the Garamantes on a military campaign that lasted 4 months and ended in a place called Agasimba, a name that appears in the historical record exactly once, in this passage, and nowhere else. At Agasimba, Maternus reported, there were rhinoceroses gathering, and that's where the account simply stops. Where was Agasimba? Scholars have spent more than a century trying to answer that question, and the proposed locations span an extraordinary range. Some place it near the Air Mountains in present-day Niger. Others argue for the Lake Chad Basin, hundreds of kilometers further east. A few have suggested locations even further south, closer to the Niger River itself. The honest answer is that no one knows. And the reason no one knows is that a 4-month journey, on foot or by camel, across terrain we can only roughly estimate, could plausibly end almost anywhere within an enormous swath of the Central Sahara and the Sahel beyond it. There's another question lurking underneath the first one. Did Maternus, a Roman, traveling under his own name, recorded as the leader of this expedition, actually walk that entire distance himself? Or did he travel as far as Garamantian territory extended, and then rely on Garamantian guides, soldiers, or intermediaries to make the rest of the journey, reporting back what they found? The Garamantes were, after all, the ones with the knowledge, the routes, and the relationships with peoples further south. It's entirely possible that the Roman expedition beyond the Sahara was, in practice, a Garamantian one, with a Roman name attached to it for the benefit of readers back in the Mediterranean world. And then there's the matter of what was actually moving across these routes, long before and after Maternus. Roman-era glass beads, pottery fragments, and coins have turned up at sites scattered across the Sahara and into West Africa, evidence of trade networks that clearly extended far beyond anything described in surviving texts. Across the desert, particularly in the Atlas foothills and parts of the Central Sahara, there are also rock engravings depicting 2-wheeled chariots, arranged in lines that some researchers have proposed mark out ancient routes, possible chariot roads linking the Mediterranean coast to the bend of the Niger River. Whether these engravings date to the Roman period or to a much earlier era entirely remains genuinely disputed. If they are earlier, They suggest that trans-Saharan contact wasn't a Roman discovery at all, but something Rome simply tapped into, a network that had existed in some form for a very long time before anyone wrote it down. What we're left with, in the end, is a handful of names. Flaccus, Maternus, the king of the Garamantes, a handful of durations, 3 months, 4 months, and a single word, Agasimba, that appears once in the historical record and then vanishes as completely as the men who reported it. No return journey is described. No further expeditions are mentioned. Within a few centuries, the Garamantian civilization itself went into decline, likely as its aquifers ran dry and its tunnels filled with sand, taking with it whatever local knowledge might have filled in the gaps. So the questions remain, much as they do for the stone tower far to the east. Did these men reach a place we could point to on a modern map? And if so, which place? Did they return to tell more of the story than the few lines that survive? And somewhere beneath the dunes of the central Sahara, is there still evidence, an inscription, an artifact, a marker of a journey that, for the rest of history, has existed only as a name and a number of months? If a single phrase in a Roman geography text could spark a debate that has lasted nearly 2,000 years, consider what happens when the evidence comes from an entire civilization. One that built no monuments we can point to, left no inscriptions in its own name, and is known to us almost entirely through the writings of outsiders. Picture the valley of the Amu Darya, the river the ancient Greeks called the Oxus, cutting through the borderlands of what is now northern Afghanistan, southern Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. The land here is layered with history the way sediment layers a riverbed. Greek colonial cities built after Alexander's conquests, Bactrian kingdoms that rose from their ruins, and later the great Kushan Empire, whose coins and sculptures still turn up in museum collections around the world. Somewhere in this valley, more than 2,000 years ago, stood a city that does not appear on any map we have today. A capital whose name survives only in a handful of characters written by a Chinese envoy who saw it with his own eyes. That envoy was Zhang Qian, sent west around 130 BC by the Han Dynasty court on a diplomatic mission that turned into one of the great journeys of the ancient world. Captured, imprisoned for years, and eventually released, Zhang Qian pressed on regardless. And what he brought back was the first detailed account China had ever received of the lands beyond its western frontier. Among the peoples he described were the Yuezhi, a nomadic group who had once lived near the edges of Chinese territory until they were driven out by a rival confederation, the Xiongnu, in a defeat so severe that, according to the records, the Yuezhi king was killed and his skull turned into a ceremonial drinking vessel. Forced from their homeland, the Yuezhi migrated west, first into the region around the Ili River, then further still, eventually crossing into Bactria, where Zhang Qian found them settled north of the Oxus, ruling over a population that included the remnants of the old Greco-Bactrian kingdoms. He described their territory, their customs, even something of their capital. And then, for all practical purposes, the trail goes cold. We know what happened to the Yuezhi afterward, in broad strokes. Within a few generations, one of their tribes, the Kushans, rose to dominate the others and built an empire that would stretch across Central Asia and into northern India, becoming one of the great powers of the ancient world, trading with Rome, Han China, and the kingdoms of South Asia all at once. But the city Zhang Qian visited, the capital of the Yuezhi as they existed in that brief window after their migration and before their transformation into the Kushan state, has never been definitively located. Archaeologists have proposed several candidates. Some point to Ai-Khanoum, the spectacular Greco-Bactrian city excavated by French teams starting in the 1960s, with its Greek-style theater, gymnasium, and temples, though most evidence suggests this city had already been abandoned or destroyed by the time the Yuezhi arrived, raising the question of whether they occupied its ruins, built nearby, or went somewhere else entirely. Others have suggested sites further south, near Kunduz, or locations closer to the Oxus crossing near Termez, where the river narrows and ancient trade routes converge. The site known as Takti Sangin, the Temple of the Oxus, has also entered the discussion. A riverside sanctuary that remained in use across multiple periods, layered with offerings from successive cultures. The trouble is that the Yuezhi, as Zhang Qian encountered them, were still in many ways a mobile, recently arrived power. Did they build a capital in the way settled civilizations do, with walls, temples, palaces meant to last? Or did they instead occupy and adapt existing Bactrian and Greek cities, leaving behind little that would distinguish Yuezhi occupation from the layers above and below it? If the latter, then the lost capital may not be lost in the sense of being undiscovered. It may already be sitting in an excavation report somewhere, unrecognized, because nothing about it looks distinctly Yuezhi to the people digging it up. There's a deeper question lurking here too, one that connects to debates far beyond Bactria. Who were the Yuezhi, really? Some linguists and historians have proposed a connection between the Yuezhi and the Tacharian-speaking populations, whose mummified remains have been found preserved in the deserts of the Tarim Basin, far to the east, bodies notable for features that some researchers have described as unusual for the region, fueling decades of speculation about long-distance population movements across Eurasia in the centuries before Zhang Qian's journey. The connection remains debated, and the evidence is far from conclusive, but it's part of why the Yuezhi occupy such an unusual place in the historical record. They are simultaneously well documented in the sense that we have written accounts of their movements across thousands of kilometers, and almost entirely invisible archaeologically in the sense that we cannot point to a single site and say with confidence, this is where they lived. This is what they built. This is what they left behind. So somewhere beneath the orchards and irrigation canals of the Oxus Valley, or perhaps already excavated, already catalogued, already sitting in a museum storeroom under a different name, are the remains of a city that a Chinese envoy once walked through, took notes on, and described to an emperor thousands of kilometers away. The records say it existed. The question that remains is whether anyone, looking at the ruins we already have, has ever actually stood inside it. Not every civilization that vanishes does so completely. Sometimes the center falls, the city is taken, the ruler paraded through foreign streets, and the edges simply scatter. People slip away, carrying what they can. And then, within a generation, they disappear from the record entirely. Not because they ceased to exist, but because no one was left to write about them. The ruins of Palmyra still stand in the Syrian desert, roughly halfway between the Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates River. Columns of honey-colored limestone rising from a flat, sun-bleached plain, arranged in colonnades so long and so precisely aligned that, even in their broken state, they seem to belong to a city far larger and far more powerful than any desert settlement has a right to be. And for a time, Palmyra was exactly that. In the 3rd century AD, this was one of the wealthiest cities in the Roman world, a trading hub where caravans from Mesopotamia, Persia, Arabia, and the Mediterranean all converged, exchanging silk, spices, textiles, and perfumes in markets that operated in at least 4 languages. And at the center of this world, for a brief and extraordinary period, stood a woman named Zenobia. By 270 AD, Zenobia had declared independence from Rome, styling herself empress of a domain that stretched from Egypt in the south to Anatolia in the north, encompassing Syria, Palestine, and much of the eastern Mediterranean. Her court attracted scholars, philosophers, and military commanders from across the ancient world. The historian Longinus served as her advisor. Her armies were led by generals capable enough to defeat Roman legions in open battle. For roughly 5 years, the Palmyrene Empire was, by any reasonable measure, a rival to Rome itself. It didn't last. In 272 AD, the Emperor Aurelian marched east with a force large enough to end the rebellion decisively. He defeated Zenobia's armies at Emei and again at Emesa, modern-day Homs, then besieged Palmyra itself. Zenobia attempted to flee east toward Persia, hoping to reach the Sasanian court and secure an alliance. But she was captured at the Euphrates, reportedly while boarding a boat. Aurelian took her back to Rome, where, according to the most widely repeated account, she was displayed in golden chains during his triumph. What happened to Zenobia herself after the triumph is debated. Some sources say she was granted a villa near Tivoli and lived out her years in comfortable exile. Others suggest she died shortly after, possibly by illness or by her own hand. But Zenobia's personal fate, uncertain as it is only part of the story. The deeper mystery belongs to the people around her, her court, her generals, her loyalists, and the population of a city that had just gambled everything on independence from the most powerful empire on Earth. Palmyra revolted again shortly after Zenobia's capture, and this time Aurelian's response was devastating. The city was sacked. Roman sources describe widespread destruction, looting, and reprisals severe enough that Palmyra never recovered its former status. Within a generation, the great trading city was reduced to a minor garrison post. But a city of perhaps 200,000 people, a network of merchants, soldiers, scribes, priests, and craftsmen spread across trade routes spanning thousands of kilometers, does not simply evaporate. Where did they go? Some certainly were absorbed into the surrounding Syrian and Arabian populations, blending into communities that already shared cultural and linguistic ties with Palmyra. Roman records mention Palmyrene soldiers serving in auxiliary units stationed as far away as Hadrian's Wall in Britain and the Danube frontier. Communities that, after the fall, may have simply stayed where they were, gradually losing their distinct identity over a few generations. Palmyrene inscriptions have been found in Egypt, in Rome itself, and along the trade routes of Mesopotamia, evidence of a diaspora that predated the rebellion and likely survived it. But there are less documented possibilities, too. Some researchers have noted that in the decades following Palmyra's fall, new settlements and fortified sites appear in the deep Arabian desert, communities that seem to emerge without clear precedent, in locations that would make sense as refuges for people fleeing Roman retribution. The connections are circumstantial, and no inscription has been found that explicitly links these sites to Palmyrene refugees. But the timing is suggestive, and the desert that sustained Palmyra's trade for centuries would have been familiar territory to anyone seeking to disappear. There are also questions about the eastward direction, the route Zenobia herself tried to take. Did any of her followers succeed where she failed? The Sasanian Empire had its own reasons to welcome enemies of Rome, and the border between the two empires was porous enough that individuals, families, even small communities could cross and resettle without leaving much of a trace in either empire's records. If Palmyrene exiles reached Persia, they would have joined a society already deeply familiar with their culture, their gods, and their language. They would have been, in a sense, invisible. What we're left with is a pattern that by now feels familiar, a moment of catastrophe, well documented, followed by a silence that no surviving text has broken. Somewhere in the deserts east of the Euphrates, or in the Arabian interior, or in the frontier provinces of a rival empire, the people who once filled the colonnades of Palmyra continued their lives, raised families, and eventually stopped being Palmyrene at all. The columns still stand. The inscriptions still mark the tombs. But the living thread, the people who walked away when the city fell, passed beyond the edge of the written record and have not yet been followed. We've mentioned his name more than once already, quietly in passing, the way you might mention a source you trust without ever having met them. Marinus of Tyre, the geographer behind the account of the stone tower, the authority Ptolemy cited when describing the expeditions of Flaccus and Maternus beyond the Sahara. Each time his name appears as a reference, a footnote, the man who wrote it down first. And each time, the same uncomfortable fact follows. Not a single page of his original work has survived. The city of Tyre sits on the coast of modern Lebanon, a narrow peninsula jutting into the Mediterranean, crowded now with apartment buildings and narrow streets layered over ruins that stretch back thousands of years. In the early 2nd century AD, this was still a city of consequence, a Phoenician port with a trading history older than Rome itself, connected by sea and road to every major center in the ancient world. It was here, or at least from here, that Marinus produced what scholars believe was the most comprehensive geographical work of its time. A systematic attempt to map the known world using a coordinate grid, assigning lines of latitude and longitude to cities, landmarks, and boundaries from the Atlantic coast to the edges of China. No copy of this work exists today. Everything we know about it comes from a single source, Claudius Ptolemy, the Alexandrian scholar who, writing a generation later, used Marinus's data as the foundation for his own geography, the work that would go on to shape European mapmaking for the next 1400 years. Ptolemy credited Marinus extensively, quoted his methods, cited his sources, and then, page by page, corrected him, adjusting coordinates, revising distances, and, in several cases, dismissing Marinus's calculations as overly generous, particularly regarding the east-west extent of the known world. It is through Ptolemy's corrections that we catch glimpses of what Marinus's maps may have shown, and in some cases, those glimpses are tantalizing. Marinus estimated the length of the known world, from the Canary Islands in the west to the coast of China in the east, at roughly 225 degrees of longitude. Ptolemy reduced this to 180 degrees, arguing that Marinus had overestimated travel distances along the Silk Road and the sea routes to Southeast Asia. Modern measurements show the actual figure to be closer to 130 degrees, meaning both men were wrong, but in an interesting way. Marinus's larger estimate, while further from the truth in absolute terms, implied a world that was more connected, more traversed, and more known than the one Ptolemy eventually drew. What if Marinus had access to information that Ptolemy chose to discard? This is where the mystery begins to deepen. Marinus, based in Tyre, would have had direct access to Phoenician maritime knowledge, centuries of accumulated sailing data from a culture that had circumnavigated Africa under the Egyptian pharaoh Necho II as early as the 7th century BC, that had established colonies from Carthage to the Atlantic coast of Morocco, and that had, by some accounts, ventured further into the open ocean than any Mediterranean civilization before or since. If any geographer in the ancient world was positioned to receive reports from the far edges of the known world, from sailors, traders, and travelers passing through one of the oldest ports in the Mediterranean, it was someone working in Tyre. Yet we cannot verify any of this, because the original is gone, and the question of why it's gone is itself worth pausing over. Marinus's work wasn't obscure. Ptolemy treated it as the standard reference of its era, the best available synthesis of geographical knowledge in the Roman world. A work of that stature would normally have been copied, stored in libraries, referenced by later scholars, and preserved through the same channels that kept Ptolemy's own text alive. But it wasn't. Somewhere between the 2nd century and the medieval period, every copy disappeared. Was it simply a matter of replacement, Ptolemy's version being seen as superior, making Marinus's original redundant, the way a second edition renders the first disposable? That's the most common explanation, and it's plausible. History is full of works that were lost not because they were suppressed, but because they were superseded. But it's also possible that Marinus's maps contain details, routes, coordinates, coastlines, that didn't align with the version of the world Ptolemy chose to present, and that the survival of one contributed to the disappearance of the other, not through any deliberate act, but simply through the quiet mechanics of which texts get copied and which get left behind. Some historians have speculated further. If Marinus's coordinate system was indeed more expansive than Ptolemy's, if his maps showed a wider, more traversable world, then his work may have contained information about trade routes, coastlines, and distant peoples that no surviving ancient text preserves. The accounts of the Stone Tower, of Agasimba, of the sea routes to Southeast Asia, these survive only as fragments, filtered through Ptolemy's editorial judgment. What Marinus originally recorded in full is something we may never know. And so, the man whose data underpins one of the most influential works in the history of cartography remains himself, almost entirely invisible. His coordinates were used, his sources were cited, his conclusions were corrected, And then his maps, the originals, the ones drawn from first-hand reports in a Phoenician port city with 3,000 years of seafaring behind it, were allowed to vanish. What was on them exactly, that Ptolemy kept? What was on them that he didn't? And is there, somewhere in an uncatalogued manuscript, a library basement, or a collection not yet digitized, a copy that has simply been waiting, unrecognized, for someone to look? Maps, as we've seen, can vanish. Entire coordinate systems can be lost, taking with them coastlines, trade routes, and the names of places no one alive can identify. But maps, at least, are objects. Things written on papyrus or vellum, stored in buildings, subject to fire, flood, and neglect. What happens when it's not a map that disappears, but an entire people? The steppes of Central Asia stretch from the edges of the Caspian Sea to the borders of China, a vast, undulating grassland broken by mountain ranges, river valleys, and deserts that for most of recorded history produced peoples faster than the literate civilizations around them could name them. Waves of migration rolled westward and southward across these plains for millennia, and the settled kingdoms on the periphery, Greek, Persian, Chinese, Indian, struggled to keep track. Names appeared in one text, vanished from the next, and reappeared centuries later in a different language, applied to a group that may or may not have been the same one. Among the most puzzling of these vanishing names is one that surfaces briefly in a handful of classical sources, plays a role in one of the most consequential events in Central Asian history, and then disappears so completely that scholars have spent generations arguing over whether the people it described ever truly existed as a distinct group at all. The Asii. The name appears in the work of the Roman historian Pompeius Trogus, writing in the late 1st century BC, preserved only in an abridgment by a later writer named Justin. In this account, the destruction of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom, the last remnant of Alexander the Great's eastern conquests, was carried out by a coalition of nomadic peoples who swept down from the north sometime around 145 to 130 BC. Among them, Trogus names the Asiani and the Tachari. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing around the same period, provides a slightly different list. The Asioi, the Pasianoi, the Tocharoi, and the Sakaraukai, 4 tribes, he says, who came from the territory beyond the Jaxartes River, the modern Sirdaria, and who together overwhelmed the Greek rulers of Bactria. And that is very nearly all we have. The Tachari, or Tacharians, went on to leave a significant mark, their name attached, however controversially, to a language family preserved in manuscripts found in the Tarim Basin 1,000 years later. The Sakarauki have been tentatively linked to Scythian or Saka groups known from other sources. But the Asii, the Asiani, the Asioi, however you transliterate the name, seem to step onto the stage of history for a single act and then exit without a trace. Who were they? The simplest answer, and the one most commonly offered, is that the Asii were one of the tribal components of the Yuezhi Confederation, the same displaced nomads we encountered earlier, the ones Zhang Shen found settled north of the Oxus. Under this reading, the Asii weren't a separate people at all. They were the Yuezhi as seen from the other side, described by Greek and Roman writers who had no access to Chinese sources and who naturally used different names for the same groups. Some scholars have gone further, proposing that the name Asii may be connected to the Kushans themselves, that the tribe Trogus called the Asiani eventually became the ruling clan of the Kushan Empire, their old name simply falling out of use as the new political identity took hold. It's a tidy explanation, but it rests on an assumption that can't be verified, that 2 completely independent textual traditions, one Chinese and one Greco-Roman, were describing the same people using different names, and that the correspondences we see are real rather than coincidental. The truth is that Central Asia in the 2nd century BC was home to a vast number of mobile, semi-nomadic populations, many of whom shared similar lifestyles, similar military tactics, and similar migration patterns. The fact that two groups moved through the same region at roughly the same time doesn't necessarily mean they were the same group. There are other proposals, less widely accepted but not easily dismissed. Some researchers have suggested that the Asii may have been an Iranian-speaking people distinct from the Yuezhi, possibly related to the Alans or other groups that later migrated westward into the Caucasus and eventually into Europe. Others have noted a faint phonetic resemblance between Asii and early forms of the name Asia itself, a connection that most linguists regard as coincidental, but that has persisted in the margins of the scholarly literature for over a century, raising the strange possibility that an entire continent bears the name of a people no one can identify. What makes the Asii so frustrating and so fascinating is that they appear at a genuine hinge point in history. The fall of the Greco-Bactrian kingdom was not a minor event. It marked the end of Greek political power in Central Asia, cleared the way for the rise of the Kushan Empire, and reshaped the trade routes that would eventually become the Silk Road. The people who caused that transformation are named, listed, counted in the sources. And yet for at least one of those names, we cannot say with confidence who they were, where they came from, where they went, or whether the name itself referred to a single people, or was simply a label applied from the outside to a group that never used it. Somewhere in the space between a Greek historian's list and a Chinese envoy's report, the Asii exist. Briefly, uncertainly, defined more by the questions they raise than by anything the sources actually say about them. They helped bring down a kingdom. They may have helped build an empire, and then they became what the steppes have always been so efficient at producing, a name without a people, carried forward by the wind and the written word, belonging to no one anyone can find. A name without a people, we said, carried forward only by the written word. But what happens when the written word itself is what's lost? When the records, the archives, the accumulated documents of an entire civilization are destroyed not gradually, not through neglect, but in a single catastrophic act. And what survives is only what happened to be somewhere else at the time. The old city of Jerusalem sits on a limestone ridge in the hills of Palestine, compact and ancient, its streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. At its eastern edge, a broad stone platform rises above the surrounding neighborhoods, the site known to Jews as the Temple Mount and to Muslims as the Haram al-Sharif. Today, the golden dome of the rock catches the light above walls built and rebuilt by Herodian, Roman, Byzantine, and Ottoman hands. But beneath the surface, cut into the bedrock itself, are chambers, cisterns, and passageways that date back far earlier, remnants of a complex that, for nearly 1,000 years, served as the religious, political, and administrative heart of the Jewish people. The Temple of Jerusalem was not simply a place of worship. It was a repository. Ancient sources describe it as the custodian of genealogical records tracing family lines back generations, records essential for establishing priestly lineage, tribal membership, and legal inheritance. The historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century AD, mentions these genealogies explicitly, noting that priestly families maintained meticulous documentation of their ancestry and that copies were kept in the temple's archives. Legal documents, land records, financial accounts related to the temple treasury, and texts of religious and historical significance were stored there as well. For the people of ancient Judea, the temple was not just sacred space. It was institutional memory, made physical and kept under guard. That memory was destroyed twice. The first destruction came in 586 BC, when the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar II besieged Jerusalem, broke through its walls, and razed the temple that tradition attributes to King Solomon. The population was deported to Babylon, and whatever records the temple held were either carried off as plunder, burned in the destruction, or buried in the rubble. When the exiles returned decades later and built the Second Temple, they did so with a broken chain of documentation. Certain texts had survived, carried into exile, or preserved in communities outside Jerusalem, but much had not. The Second Temple's archives began, in a sense, from a point of recovery rather than continuity. Over the following centuries, those archives grew again. By the 1st century AD, the Second Temple complex, massively expanded under Herod the Great, had become one of the largest religious sites in the ancient world. A sprawling compound of courtyards, colonnades, storage chambers, and administrative offices. Josephus describes the temple treasury as holding enormous wealth, and the archives as containing records vital to the functioning of Jewish society. And then, in 70 AD, the Roman general Titus besieged Jerusalem, breached its defenses, and destroyed the temple so thoroughly that, according to Josephus, virtually nothing was left standing. The destruction was not incidental. Roman soldiers, Josephus writes, set fire to the temple itself, and the conflagration consumed not only the structure, but everything inside it. The sacred vessels were carried to Rome, depicted famously on the Arch of Titus, still standing in the Roman Forum. But the documents, the genealogies, the administrative records accumulated over more than 5 centuries, these, so far as the surviving sources tell us, simply burned. Or did they? This is where the mystery fractures into possibilities. Some scholars have argued that the temple's most important documents would not have been stored in a single location, that copies existed in synagogues, private collections, and communities throughout Palestine and the wider Jewish diaspora, and that the destruction of the temple, devastating as it was, did not necessarily mean the destruction of everything it held. The survival of biblical texts, after all, demonstrates that at least some literary works made it through both destructions intact, preserved by communities far from Jerusalem. Others point to more intriguing possibilities. The Copper Scroll, discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls near Qumran in 1952, is unlike any other document in that collection. Written on thin sheets of copper rather than parchment, it contains not religious or literary text, but what appears to be a list of hiding places. 64 locations where gold, silver, and other valuables were supposedly concealed, many of them described in relation to landmarks in and around Jerusalem. The scroll has been dated to roughly the mid-1st century AD, placing it tantalizingly close to the period just before the Roman siege. Was this a record of the temple treasury, dispersed and hidden in anticipation of the coming destruction? Or was it something else entirely? A literary fiction, an inventory of wealth that never existed, a symbolic text misread as a practical one? No location described in the Copper Scroll has yielded the treasures it lists. Some of the landmarks it references can no longer be identified, and the question of whether it relates to the temple at all remains, after 7 decades of study, genuinely unresolved. What we know is this. For nearly 1,000 years, the Temple of Jerusalem served as the central archive of a civilization, a storehouse of identity, lineage, law, and memory. That archive was destroyed, rebuilt, and destroyed again, each time taking with it documents that no surviving copy has replaced. Somewhere in the chain of custody, between the burning and the rebuilding, between the hiding and the forgetting, records that once defined an entire people's understanding of themselves passed out of reach. Whether they were truly destroyed, or whether some portion of them still lies sealed in a cave, buried beneath a foundation, or preserved in a collection whose owners never knew what they had, is a question that the stones of Jerusalem have so far declined to answer. Archives can burn, names can fade from the record, but sometimes a place is described in such specific practical detail, its exports listed, its rulers named, its position along a trade route carefully noted, and still, somehow, no one can find it. Not because the description is vague, but because the coastline has changed, the name has shifted, and the centuries have buried whatever was there under layers of sand, mangrove, and coral. Imagine the western shore of the Indian Ocean as it appeared 2,000 years ago, a long, curving coastline running south from the Horn of Africa, fringed with mangrove swamps, tidal inlets, and shallow harbors where wooden boats could shelter from the monsoon winds. The air is heavy, warm, thick with salt and the smell of drying fish. Somewhere along this coast, according to a Greek-language trading manual written in the 1st century AD, lay a market town called Rapta, the southernmost point of the known commercial world, the last place where Mediterranean merchants could reliably trade before the coast dissolved into territory no one from the north had mapped. The text that describes it is called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, Erythraean being the ancient term for what we now call the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Western Indian Ocean. It was written not by a scholar or a geographer, but most likely by a merchant, someone who had actually sailed these waters and was recording in plain and businesslike language the ports, products, and political realities a trader would need to know. The Periplus describes dozens of trading stations from the Egyptian port of Berenice on the Red Sea coast, south along the Horn of Africa, across to the Arabian Peninsula, and east to the ports of India. Its descriptions are remarkably specific: which harbors are safe, which rulers are friendly, what goods to bring, and what to expect in return. When the author reaches the East African coast, the tone doesn't change. He describes a series of trading posts running southward: Opone, probably near modern Hafun in Somalia, the islands of Manuthias, likely Zanzibar or Pemba, and then, at the end of the line, Rapta. The name, he notes, comes from the small sewn boats used by the local population. Raptin, in Greek, meaning stitched or sewn together. The town, he says, exports ivory, rhinoceros horn, tortoiseshell, and nautical shell, and is under the authority of a governor appointed by the Kingdom of Arabia's southwestern coast. Arab traders, he adds, have been visiting for so long that they have intermarried with the local population and speak the local language. It is a vivid, detailed, credible description. And no one has ever found the place. The search for Rapta has occupied archaeologists and historians for over a century. The most commonly proposed location is somewhere along the coast of modern Tanzania, near the Rufiji River Delta, a region of mangrove channels, shifting sandbanks, and tidal flats that would match the Periplus's description of a shallow, swampy anchorage. In the early 2000s, a British archaeologist named Felix Chami reported finding pottery and trade goods consistent with the right period on Mafia Island, just offshore, and proposed it as a strong candidate for the Manuthias described in the text, with Rapta itself lying somewhere in the nearby delta. But the delta is an extraordinarily difficult environment for archaeology. Sediment shifts constantly, structures built from wood and thatch leave almost no trace, and rising sea levels over 2 millennia may have submerged whatever once stood there. Others have pushed the location further south, toward Mozambique, or further north, closer to the Kenyan coast. A few researchers have questioned whether Rapta was a single fixed settlement at all, suggesting instead that it may have been a seasonal trading camp, a place that existed only during the monsoon trading season, when merchants from Arabia and the Red Sea coast arrived with the northeasterly winds, conducted their business, and departed with the southwesterlies a few months later. If that's the case, Rapta may never have had permanent structures to leave behind. But the mystery extends beyond location. The Periplus describes Rapta as part of a functioning political and commercial network, governed from across the sea, integrated into Indian Ocean trade, producing exports that ended up in markets as far away as Rome. That implies a level of social organization, economic activity, and long-distance communication that is rarely associated with the East African coast in this period. If the Periplus is accurate, then the coast south of the Horn of Africa was not a remote frontier in the 1st century AD, but an active participant in a trading system that stretched from the Mediterranean to India. And if that's true, then the history of East Africa's engagement with the wider world may need to be pushed back further than most conventional narratives allow. What makes Rapta so compelling is the precision of its absence. This is not a place mentioned in a myth or a legend. It is described in a practical document by someone who had reason to be accurate, with details specific enough to suggest first-hand knowledge. The sewn boats, the ivory, the Arab merchants who stayed and married. These are not the details of a fantasy. They are the details of a place someone visited, traded in, and wrote down for the benefit of the next person making the voyage. and yet the coast keeps its silence. The mangroves grow and recede, the tides rearrange the delta, and somewhere beneath the mud and coral of the East African shore, a market town that once connected two worlds may still be waiting, not lost exactly, but simply not yet found. If the eastern coast of Africa conceals a trading port described in plain, practical language by someone who likely visited it, the western coast holds mysteries of a different kind, older, stranger, and reported by travelers whose accounts have been questioned, debated, and puzzled over for more than 2,000 years. The Atlantic coast of Africa falls away southward from the Strait of Gibraltar in a long, sweeping curve. First the dry, tawny shores of Morocco, then the vast emptiness of the Western Sahara, then gradually a greening coastline where rivers begin to reach the sea, carrying with them the sediment of forests and highlands far inland. For most of the ancient Mediterranean world, this coast was the edge of everything. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the ocean stretched westward into nothing anyone had mapped, and southward into regions so remote that the reports of those who claimed to have sailed there were met with as much suspicion as curiosity. The most famous of those reports belongs to Hanno, a Carthaginian navigator who, sometime around the 5th century BC, led a fleet of 60 ships through the Strait of Gibraltar and south along the African coast. His account, preserved in a Greek translation known as the Periplus of Hanno, describes a voyage of extraordinary ambition, founding colonies, encountering rivers full of crocodiles, passing volcanic mountains that lit up the night sky, and meeting populations whose customs and languages were entirely unfamiliar to his crews. The text is short, compressed, and at times maddeningly vague, but it contains details that have kept scholars occupied for centuries. Among the most intriguing are the references to organized societies, settlements with walls, markets, and apparent political structures, encountered at various points along the coast. Hanno describes a place he calls Shern, an island that served as a trading post, and that he compares in distance and function to Carthage's relationship with other Mediterranean ports. He mentions interpreters traveling with the fleet, suggesting that Carthage already had enough prior contact with some of these coastal peoples to have learned elements of their languages. And further south, he describes encounters with populations who fled at the approach of his ships, lit fires along the hills at night, and produced sounds of drums and cymbals that echoed across the water, suggesting not isolated bands, but communities large enough to coordinate a response. Where exactly was Hanno? The question has never been settled. Cerny has been placed everywhere from Herne Island off the coast of Western Sahara to Arguin Island near Mauritania to locations further south near the Senegal River. The volcanic mountain that burned with fire, which Hanno called the Chariot of the Gods, has been identified with Mount Cameroon, Mount Tyre in the Canary Islands, and several points in between. The southernmost extent of the voyage has been argued as far down as Gabon, Sierra Leone, or even the Gulf of Guinea, depending on how one interprets the distances and landmarks described. But the deeper mystery isn't where Hanno went. It's what he found there, and what it implies about what existed along that coast before anyone from the Mediterranean arrived to write it down. Hanno's account is not the only ancient reference to organized kingdoms in West Africa. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, describes the Nasamones, a Libyan people who sent young men on an expedition across the Sahara. After months of travel, these men reportedly reached a city beside a great river flowing eastward, inhabited by people of small stature, a passage that some researchers have linked to the Niger River and the communities along its banks. Centuries later, Roman-era sources mention trans-Saharan trade in gold, salt, and slaves, implying the existence of markets, rulers, and political structures deep in the West African interior, structures that must have existed for the trade to function, but that no Mediterranean writer ever described in detail. What we are left with, then, is a series of glimpses, brief, fragmentary, seen from the deck of a ship or the far end of a trade route, of societies that clearly existed, clearly had structure and complexity, and yet remain unidentified in any way that connects them to the archaeological or historical record as we currently understand it. The great West African empires that later sources describe, Ghana, Mali, Songhai date to a much later period. But the evidence, thin as it is, suggests that something was there before them. Not necessarily empires on the same scale, but organized communities, trading networks, political entities capable of building walls, maintaining markets, and responding to the arrival of foreign ships with coordinated signals along miles of coastline. Were these the predecessors of the later Sahelian empires, their names lost because no local written tradition preserved them? Were they independent polities that rose and fell long before the trans-Saharan gold trade brought West Africa into the wider historical record? Or were they something else entirely? Societies whose trajectories we cannot trace because the only people who wrote about them were passing through on ships, recording what they saw in a few hurried lines, and never coming back? The Atlantic still breaks against that long curving coast. The rivers still carry their red sediment to the sea. And somewhere behind the shoreline, behind the mangroves, behind the dunes, behind the centuries of silence, the kingdoms Hanno glimpsed from the water may still be waiting, not in legend or in myth, but in the ground itself, unexcavated, unnamed, their walls just below the surface of a history that has not yet learned to look for them. Kingdoms hidden behind coastlines, buried beneath centuries of silence. These are mysteries of absence, of things that existed but were never recorded in enough detail to be found again. But there is another kind of mystery, perhaps even more frustrating. The mystery of something that was recorded, that was seen by thousands, that was carried across hundreds of kilometers in broad daylight, and then, at the very last moment, was deliberately hidden and has never been seen since. In August of 410 AD, the city of Rome fell. It had been centuries since Rome functioned as the true seat of imperial power. The emperors had long since moved to Milan, then Ravenna, then Constantinople. But Rome was still Rome. Its temples still held treasures accumulated over 800 years of conquest. Its forums were lined with statues looted from Greece, Egypt, Carthage, and every corner of the Mediterranean. Its private homes, its churches, its public buildings contained gold, silver, jewels, silks, and artwork that represented in material form the wealth of the greatest empire the Western world had ever known. When Alaric I, king of the Visigoths, breached the Salarian Gate after a prolonged siege, his forces spent 3 days inside the city. The ancient sources differ on the degree of destruction. Some describe widespread burning and slaughter. Others suggest a relatively restrained sack, with churches designated as sanctuaries and certain buildings left untouched. But on one point, the sources agree. The Visigoths took an extraordinary quantity of treasure, gold and silver in vast amounts, sacred vessels from Roman temples, precious objects from private collections, and according to the historian Procopius, writing more than a century later, possibly even items taken from the Temple of Jerusalem, treasures that the Emperor Titus had brought to Rome after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, displayed in his triumph, and stored in the city ever since. If Procopius is correct, then the sack of Rome created a chain of plunder stretching back over 3 centuries, objects sacred to the Jewish people, seized by Rome, now seized again by the Visigoths, carried southward out of the city by an army on the move. The menorah, the golden table, the silver trumpets depicted on the Arch of Titus. Were these among the items Alaric's men loaded onto carts and carried away? The possibility has been debated for centuries, and no definitive answer has ever been established. But the question matters, because it shapes our understanding of just how significant the missing treasure may be, not merely in monetary terms, but in historical and religious ones. What happened next is where the mystery deepens. Alaric marched south through Italy, reportedly intending to cross to North Africa, the breadbasket of the Western Mediterranean, and a prize that would have secured the Visigoths' long-term survival. But he never made the crossing. In late 410 AD, only months after the sack of Rome, Alaric died near the city of Cosenza, in Calabria, at the southern tip of the Italian peninsula. The cause of his death is not recorded with certainty. illness is the most common explanation, possibly fever contracted in the swampy lowlands of the south. What followed his death is one of the most striking burial accounts in ancient history. The Gothic historian Jordanes, writing in the 6th century, describes how Alaric's followers diverted the course of the Busento River near Cosenza, buried their king in the riverbed along with a portion of his most prized possessions, and then returned the river to its original course, sealing the grave beneath flowing water. The laborers who carried out the work, Jordanes adds, were killed afterward, so that no one would ever be able to reveal the location. It is a dramatic story, and it raises immediate questions. How much of the treasure taken from Rome was buried with Alaric? Was it a symbolic portion? A king's personal share? Weapons, armor, a few precious objects? Or something more substantial? The sources don't say. No inventory survives. No list was made, or if one was, it has not come down to us. The Visigoths, at this point in their history, were not a bureaucratic civilization. They did not, so far as we know, maintain the kind of written records that would document the contents of a royal burial. What went into the river went without a receipt. Attempts to find the burial site have been made repeatedly over the centuries, most recently in the early 21st century, when Italian authorities and international researchers launched investigations using modern survey technology along the Busento near its confluence with the Croti River. So far, nothing conclusive has been found. The riverbed has shifted over 16 centuries. The alluvial deposits are deep, and the possibility remains that Jordanes' account, however vivid, may have been embellished, that the river burial was a literary flourish rather than a literal description, or that the location he implied was deliberately misleading, designed to protect the grave even from future readers. And behind all of this lies the deeper question, the one that connects Alaric's treasure to the missing archives of Jerusalem and the lost inventories of empires that rose and fell before anyone thought to write things down. What exactly was taken? If the treasures of the Temple of Jerusalem were among the spoils, then somewhere beneath a river in southern Italy, objects last seen in a Roman triumph nearly 2,000 years ago may still exist, buried not by accident or neglect, but by design, hidden by men who wanted them never to be found, and who succeeded so completely that even the memory of what was buried has become uncertain. The Busento still flows through Cosenza, quiet and unremarkable, its waters passing over whatever lies beneath without offering any sign. The treasure, if it is there, does not announce itself. It simply waits, as it has waited now for 16 centuries, for someone to find what was meant to stay hidden forever. A river hides a king. A riverbed becomes a vault, and the men who buried him are silenced, ensuring that whatever lies beneath the water stays beyond the reach of history. But there are other ways to disappear from the record, ways that don't require a river or a deliberate act of concealment. Sometimes a civilization simply exists on the wrong side of someone else's story, described only by its enemies, defined only by the moments it caused trouble, and then, when the trouble stops, allowed to fade from the page as though it had never been there at all. The eastern desert of Egypt is one of the most inhospitable landscapes on Earth. A vast plateau of sun-scorched rock and gravel stretching from the Nile Valley east to the Red Sea coast, cut by dry riverbeds called wadis that fill briefly and violently during rare rains before going silent again for months or years. The heat is relentless. Water sources are scarce and jealously guarded. The terrain is broken, jagged, stripped of almost everything that might sustain human life. And yet, for centuries, this desert was home to a people who not only survived in it, but built a political and military presence powerful enough to challenge the Roman Empire itself. The Greeks and Romans called them the Blemmyes. They appear in the historical record as early as the 3rd century BC, mentioned in connection with the land south of Egypt's traditional frontier at Aswan, in the region the ancients called Nubia. By the 3rd century AD, the Blemmyes had become a serious concern for Roman Egypt, raiding settlements in Upper Egypt, seizing control of trade routes through the eastern desert, and, on at least one occasion, occupying the city of Koptos, a major junction between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea ports. Roman emperors sent punitive expeditions against them. Diocletian, in the late 3rd century, reportedly withdrew the Roman frontier northward from the region around the First Cataract, ceding territory to the Blemmyes and their neighbors, the Nobatae, a strategic retreat that acknowledged in practice that Rome could no longer hold its southernmost positions against a people it had spent decades trying to subdue. The Blemmyes were not merely raiders. Evidence from the temple complex at Philae, on an island in the Nile near Aswan, shows that they maintained a religious presence at one of the most sacred sites in the ancient world, the Temple of Isis at Philae, which continued to function as an active place of worship long after Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. An agreement between the Roman authorities and the Blemmyes, recorded in the 5th century, specifically guaranteed the Blemmyes' right to visit the temple and to borrow the cult statue of Isis for use in their own religious ceremonies. This was not a concession made to a disorganized tribal group. It was a diplomatic arrangement with a political entity that had enough power to negotiate terms. And yet, despite all of this, despite centuries of interaction with one of the most literate civilizations in history, we have almost nothing written by the Blemmyes themselves. This is the silence at the heart of the mystery. The Blemmyes clearly had political organization, kings, ambassadors, treaties. They controlled trade routes carrying gold, emeralds, and exotic goods from the African interior to the Mediterranean markets. They maintained religious practices sophisticated enough to participate in the cult of Isis alongside Egyptian priests. But if they kept records, composed texts, or maintained archives of any kind, none have survived. Their language, believed by most linguists to be an early form of the Beja languages still spoken today in parts of Sudan, Egypt, and Erythraea, was not, so far as we know, written down during the period of their greatest power. Everything we know about the Blemmyes comes from the people who fought them, taxed them, negotiated with them, and in some cases, feared them. What would those records have contained, if they existed? The Blemmyes controlled the eastern desert for the better part of a millennium. They would have known the locations of wells, mines, and mountain passes that no Roman surveyor ever mapped. They would have maintained genealogies, alliances, and political relationships with neighboring peoples, the Nobatae, the Kingdom of Meroe, the Aksumite Empire to the south, that the Mediterranean sources mention only in passing. They would have had their own account of the wars with Rome, their own version of the treaties, their own understanding of why the frontier moved the way it did. And then there is the question that lingers beneath the surface, the one that connects the Blemmyes to a much stranger chapter in ancient literature. In the works of Pliny the Elder, Pomponius Mela, and later medieval writers, the Blemmyes are described not as a desert-dwelling kingdom, but as a race of headless men, creatures whose faces were set into their chests, with eyes where their nipples should have been. This image became one of the most enduring motifs in medieval European art and literature, appearing in manuscripts, maps, and travel accounts for more than 1,000 years. It is, of course, fantasy. But it is fantasy built on top of a real people, a real name, a real civilization that existed in a real place. And the fact that the mythological version became more famous than the historical one raises its own unsettling question. How much of what we think we know about ancient peoples is shaped not by what they actually were, but by the stories their neighbors chose to tell about them? The Beja people still live in the eastern desert today, herding camels, speaking languages that may descend from whatever the Blemmyes spoke, and maintaining traditions that some ethnographers have suggested carry echoes of practices described in ancient sources. Whether the Beja are the direct descendants of the Blemmyes, or simply the modern inhabitants of the same unforgiving landscape, is a question that remains open, answered differently depending on which scholar you ask and which evidence they prioritize. What is certain is that somewhere in that desert, carved into rock, buried in sand, or carried forward in oral traditions that have never been transcribed, there may be a version of this story that the Blemmyes themselves would recognize, a version in which they are not raiders, not monsters, not footnotes in someone else's imperial history, but the protagonists of their own. Whether that version can still be recovered, or whether the desert has already claimed it, is something only the desert knows. The Blemmyes knew this desert as home, its wells, its passes, its seasons of heat and silence. But they were not the only ones who left their mark on it. Scattered across the same landscape, often visible from the same ridgelines, stand the remains of structures built by people who came from somewhere else entirely. People who arrived with orders, engineers, and supply chains stretching back to the Nile, who built in stone with military precision, and who then, at some point, simply left. The buildings remain. The people who filled them do not. The eastern desert of Egypt, between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, is laced with ancient roads, not the faint traces of caravan paths, but engineered routes, marked at regular intervals by fortified way stations the Romans called presidia. These small fortresses, typically square or rectangular, with thick stone walls, corner towers, and internal cisterns for water storage, were built to protect the routes connecting the Nile to the Red Sea ports of Berenice and Myos Hormos, through which the luxury goods of India, Arabia, and East Africa flowed into the Roman Empire. At the height of the trade in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, these roads were among the most commercially valuable corridors in the ancient world. Silk, spices, pearls, incense, ivory, all of it passed through this desert, guarded by garrisons stationed in forts that were, by design, never meant to be comfortable. Archaeologists have identified dozens of these stations. Some are remarkably well preserved, walls still standing to near their original height, doorways intact, the outlines of rooms and storage areas still clearly visible. At sites like Didymoi, Crocodilo, and Maximianon, excavations have uncovered thousands of ostraca, pottery fragments used as a cheap writing surface, bearing letters, supply requests, duty rosters, and personal correspondence written by the soldiers and civilians who lived there. These fragments offer an extraordinarily intimate window into daily life at the edge of the empire. Complaints about the heat, requests for more water, messages to family members back in the Nile Valley, and occasionally, reports of encounters with the desert peoples who lived beyond the fortified perimeter. The picture that emerges is one of organized, well-supplied, but deeply isolated outposts. Small groups of men stationed in the middle of one of the harshest environments on the planet, dependent on regular supply convoys for food, water, and basic necessities, and surrounded by a landscape that offered almost nothing if those convoys failed to arrive. The forts were not designed for permanent habitation. They were waypoints, places to rest, resupply, and shelter from the desert before moving on. And yet some of them show evidence of occupation spanning decades, even centuries, suggesting that what began as temporary infrastructure gradually became something more enduring. But it's the end of that occupation that raises the most questions. The Red Sea trade began to decline in the 3rd century AD as political instability, economic contraction, and shifting trade routes reduced the volume of goods passing through the Egyptian desert. The port of Berenice, once one of the busiest harbors in the Roman East, shrank and was eventually abandoned. Myos Hormos faded even earlier, and with the trade went the economic justification for maintaining an expensive network of desert fortifications. The conventional explanation for the abandonment of the Praesidia is straightforward. The trade dried up, the garrisons were withdrawn, and the desert reclaimed what had briefly been taken from it. But the archaeological evidence at some sites tells a more complicated story. At certain stations, excavators have found evidence suggesting not a gradual, orderly withdrawal, but something closer to a sudden departure. Personal belongings left behind, storage rooms still containing supplies, doors that appear to have been sealed or blocked from the outside as though the occupants intended to return, but never did. At others, the final layers of occupation show signs of fire, structural damage, or hasty modifications to defenses, reinforced gates, blocked windows, that suggest the last occupants were not simply leaving, but preparing for something. Were these signs of Blemmyes raids? Roman military records from the period describe increasing pressure from desert peoples on the upper Egyptian frontier, and the withdrawal of the border southward under Diocletian in the late 3rd century would have left many of these outposts exposed, cut off from the support system that had sustained them. A garrison that lost its supply line in this desert would not have lasted long. But if the abandonment was driven by attack, why do so few of the sites show clear evidence of violent destruction? And if it was driven by policy, an orderly imperial decision to withdraw, why do some of the forts look as though they were left in the middle of an ordinary day? There is also the question of the mining settlements, deeper in the desert, at sites like Mons Claudianus and Mons Porphyrites. Massive quarrying operations where thousands of workers, many of them prisoners or forced laborers, extracted granite and the rare imperial porphyry used in monuments across the empire. These sites too were abandoned, their infrastructure left standing in the desert with a completeness that is almost eerie. At Mons Claudianus, the outlines of the workers' village are still visible. Small rooms, communal areas, even an apparent temple, arranged around the quarry face as though the inhabitants had simply walked away one morning and never come back. Some researchers have speculated that the abandonment of these desert installations was not a single event, but a slow unraveling, a process that took decades, as individual stations were cut off one by one, their garrisons relocated, their supply lines quietly discontinued, until the last few outposts were left stranded in a landscape that no longer had any strategic value to anyone in a position to maintain them. Others have suggested that the transition was messier than that some garrisons may have stayed on independently after official support ended, surviving as best they could until the desert, or the Blemmyes, or simple exhaustion forced them out. What we are left with is a network of stone shells, still standing in the heat and wind of the eastern desert, their walls intact, their rooms empty, their water cisterns dry. They were built with the full weight of an empire behind them. They were maintained for centuries, and then, in a span of time the archaeological record cannot quite resolve, they were emptied of everyone who had given them purpose, leaving behind only the walls, the ostraca, and the silence of a desert that has always been very good at keeping what it is given. Deserted fortresses in the desert, their garrisons withdrawn, their purpose dissolved, structures outliving the people who built them. But not every abandoned site in the ancient world was a military outpost. Some were places of a different kind entirely, places where people came not to guard a road or extract a resource, but to listen. To stand in silence and wait for something that could not be commanded, only received. In the mountains of Epirus, in the northwest corner of Greece, a valley opens between forested ridges where the air is cooler than you'd expect, even in summer. The hills here are green, thick with oak, and the wind moves through the canopy with a sound that, if you stand still long enough, begins to feel less like weather and more like language. This is Dodona, and for more than 1,000 years, people believed that the voice of Zeus himself spoke through these trees. Dodona was old, older by some accounts than Delphi. Homer mentions it in the Iliad, describing its priests, the Seloi, he calls them, as men who slept on the ground with unwashed feet, living in deliberate closeness to the earth, as though physical contact with the soil were part of the mechanism by which divine messages were received. Herodotus, writing centuries later, offers a different tradition, that the oracle was founded by a black dove that flew from Egyptian Thebes and landed in an oak tree at Dodona, speaking in a human voice and declaring that an oracle of Zeus should be established on the spot. He also describes the priestesses, the Pleiades, the dove women, who served as interpreters of the god's will. The method of divination at Dodona was unlike anything practiced at other Greek oracles. There was no intoxicating vapor, no trance-inducing ritual, no Pythia seated above a fissure in the rock. At Dodona, the priests and priestesses listened. They listened to the wind in the sacred oak. They listened to the cooing of doves that nested in its branches. And they listened to the sound of bronze, a ring of cauldrons arranged on tripods around the sanctuary, positioned so that when one was struck, the vibration would pass from vessel to vessel, producing a continuous resonating hum that visitors described as otherworldly. From these sounds, The wind, the birds, the bronze. The priests extracted meaning, translating the noise of the natural world into answers for the people who had traveled, sometimes enormous distances, to ask their questions. We know what some of those questions were. Excavations at Dodona have uncovered thousands of lead tablets on which petitioners inscribed their queries before submitting them to the oracle. The questions are startlingly ordinary. Should I marry this woman? Will my business venture succeed? Is this child really mine? Did someone steal my blankets? These are not the questions of kings and generals. They are the concerns of everyday people, farmers, merchants, anxious parents, seeking reassurance from a source they trusted more than any human advisor. The oracle endured for centuries, through the classical period, through the wars of Alexander's successors, through Roman conquest. It was sacked by the Aetolians in 219 BC, an attack so violent that the sacred oak itself may have been damaged, though the sanctuary was rebuilt and continued to function. It was attacked again during the Mithridatic Wars. Each time, it recovered. Each time the priests returned, the cauldrons were restored, and the oak continued to stand. But sometime in the late 4th century AD, Dodona fell silent for the last time. The Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of edicts in the 380s and 390s AD that effectively banned pagan worship throughout the Roman Empire. Temples were closed, oracles were shut down, sacred groves were cut. The great oracle at Delphi had already ceased to function decades earlier. And Dodona, remote, tucked into its mountain valley, far from the main centers of imperial power, appears to have ended too, though the exact circumstances are poorly documented. Some sources suggest the sacred oak was cut down, either by Christian zealots or on imperial orders. Others suggest it simply died, its end coinciding with the end of the tradition it had sustained. What happened to the last priests? This is where the record thins to almost nothing. At Delphi, we have at least a rough sense of the oracle's final years. Diminished consultations, a reduced priesthood, a famous and perhaps apocryphal final pronouncement that the god could no longer speak. At Dodona, we have silence. No final prophecy is recorded. No last priestess is named. The lead tablets stop. The archaeological layers shift from sacred precinct to Christian basilica, built on or near the same site, as though the new faith were consciously planting itself on top of the old. But did the tradition truly end? Or did it simply move? Some scholars have noted that folk practices in the Epirus region, persisting well into the modern era, include a reverence for certain ancient trees, oaks in particular, and a tradition of listening to natural sounds for signs and portents that bears more than a passing resemblance to what the ancient sources describe at Dodona. Whether these practices represent a genuine continuity, an unbroken thread of belief stretching back to the priests who slept on the ground with unwashed feet, or whether they are simply the kind of nature-based folk religion that arises independently in rural communities everywhere, is a question no one has been able to answer definitively. The resemblance is suggestive. The evidence is not conclusive. There is also the matter of the lead tablets themselves. Thousands of them, many still unread, corroded, folded, and fragmented after more than 2 millennia in the ground. Each one contains a question asked by someone who believed, sincerely and completely, that the wind in an oak tree carried the voice of a god. The answers the priests gave are not recorded on the tablets. They were spoken aloud, heard once, and carried away by the person who asked. Whatever the oak said, whatever the priests heard in the bronze and the wind and the doves, it was never written down. And so the last voice of Dodona is not a prophecy or a warning. It is the sound of the wind itself, still moving through the oaks in that mountain valley in Epirus, still making the same sound it made when someone stood beneath those branches and believed, with absolute certainty, that it meant something. Whether it still does is a question each visitor answers for themselves, standing in the same silence the priests once filled with meaning. The wind in the oaks at Dodona carried messages that were heard, interpreted, and never written down. Answers that existed only in the moment they were spoken. But there is something arguably more haunting than a message never recorded. A journey that was completed, documented, passed from hand to hand through the ancient world's most respected geographers, and yet, somehow, reduced to a single name and a handful of coordinates. The traveler returned. The report was filed, and almost everything about it has been lost. We have encountered this name before, early in our exploration, when we stood in the shadow of the stone tower somewhere in the mountains of Central Asia. Maes Titianus, or in some transliterations, Maes the Macedonian. A merchant, a man of means, someone wealthy enough to finance an expedition along the Silk Road, or at least to send agents in his place across thousands of kilometers of mountain, desert, and steppe, from the eastern frontier of the Roman world to the borders of China. His account, or some version of it, reached Marinus of Tyre, who incorporated it into his geographical work, which was in turn absorbed and corrected by Ptolemy. And that is where the trail, for all practical purposes, ends. Picture the starting point. The most likely departure was from somewhere in the eastern Roman provinces, Syria perhaps, or Mesopotamia, where the great trading cities of Antioch, Palmyra, and later Ctesiphon served as the western anchors of the overland trade routes. From there, the road led east through the Parthian Empire, modern Iran and Iraq, across the Iranian plateau, through the oasis cities of Merv and Balkh in Central Asia, over the mountain passes of the Pamirs or the Tian Shan, and eventually into the Tarim Basin and the western reaches of the Chinese sphere of influence. It was one of the longest overland journeys possible in the ancient world, a distance of roughly 7,000 kilometers through some of the most difficult and politically complex terrain on Earth. Maes Titianus, or his agents, made this journey. We know this because Marinus used his data, distances, travel times, and the names of waypoints along the route to calculate the longitudinal extent of the known world. The stone tower, that enigmatic landmark we explored earlier, was one of those waypoints. It was Maes's account that placed it on the map, or rather, that gave Marinus the information needed to place it. Without Maes, the stone tower doesn't exist in the geographical record. Without Maes, the Western understanding of the Silk Road's central section would have a gap in it that no other ancient source fills. And yet we know almost nothing about the man himself. His name suggests a Macedonian Greek background, possibly from a family descended from the settlers left behind by Alexander's conquests, communities that persisted in the eastern Mediterranean and western Asia for centuries, maintaining Greek language and cultural identity while participating fully in the commercial networks of the region. A merchant of this background, operating in the 1st or early 2nd century AD, would have been part of a world where Greek was the language of trade, where Roman currency circulated alongside Parthian and Kushan coins, and where a sufficiently ambitious trader could, in theory, build a network stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia through a chain of partners, intermediaries, and local agents. But did Maes himself make the journey? Or did he send representatives, employees, associates, hired agents, who traveled on his behalf and reported back? Ptolemy's text, our only surviving source, is ambiguous. It refers to the journey as having been made by Maes's agents, not by Maes himself, which has led some scholars to argue that Maes was an organizer and financier rather than a traveler, a man who assembled the expedition, funded it, and collected the results, but who may never have left the eastern Mediterranean. If that's the case, the agents who actually walked the road, crossed the passes, and reached the stone tower are even more anonymous than Maes. They have no names at all. What did the full account contain? This is where the loss becomes most painful. Marinus used Maes's data primarily for distances and coordinates, the raw geographical information needed to construct a map. But a merchant's report from the Silk Road would almost certainly have included far more than that. Trade goods, prices, customs, political conditions, descriptions of cities and peoples encountered along the way. The kind of practical, observational detail that makes a text like the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea so valuable to historians. If Maes's agents were anything like the author of the Periplus, practical men, recording what they saw for the benefit of those who would follow. Their account would have been one of the most detailed descriptions of the Silk Road ever produced in the ancient Western world. Instead, we have coordinates, a name, a tower made of stone. Some historians have attempted to reconstruct the route based on the fragments Ptolemy preserves, cross-referencing them with Chinese sources that describe the western regions from the opposite direction. The results are suggestive but inconclusive. The same problem of compounding errors over vast distances that makes it impossible to locate the stone tower with certainty also makes it impossible to reconstruct Maes's itinerary with confidence. We can say, roughly, that his agents traveled through Parthian territory, crossed into Central Asia, passed through the mountains, and reached a point somewhere in the vicinity of the Tarim Basin. Beyond that, the details dissolve. There is one more layer to the mystery, a quieter one, easy to overlook. Maes Titianus is described as a merchant, and his journey is framed as a commercial enterprise. But the Silk Road in the 1st and 2nd centuries AD was not merely a trade route. It was a conduit for intelligence. The Roman and Parthian empires watched each other across a contested frontier, and both had reason to gather information about what lay beyond the other's borders. A merchant traveling east through Parthian territory with the resources to finance an expedition of this scale would have been of interest to more than just the geographical community. Was Maes simply a trader? Or was his expedition, in whole or in part, something else? A reconnaissance, a diplomatic feeler, an intelligence-gathering operation dressed in commercial clothing? There is no evidence for this. But there is also no evidence against it, because there is almost no evidence at all. Maes Titianus completed one of the longest documented journeys in ancient history, and what survives of his account could fit on a single page. The road he traveled is still there, carved through the same mountains, crossing the same deserts, passing through cities that have been continuously inhabited for 2,000 years. But the record of what he saw, who he met, and what he brought back has been reduced to a shadow, a few data points preserved by a geographer who used them to draw a map, and then, like so much else, allowed the rest to disappear. Maes Titianus sent his agents east along the Silk Road, toward a destination that the ancient Western world described in terms more suggestive of legend than geography. They were heading, as far as the sources tell us, toward the land of the Ceres, a name that appears again and again in Greek and Roman texts, always at the far edge of the known world, always associated with one commodity above all others, and always, despite centuries of contact and trade, wrapped in a fog of uncertainty that no ancient writer ever fully managed to clear. The Ceres, the Silk people. The word itself comes from the Greek ser, meaning silk, or more precisely, meaning the fiber that arrived in Mediterranean markets along trade routes so long and so indirect that the people who wore it, draped it over their furniture, and paid extraordinary prices for it, had almost no idea where it came from, how it was made, or who exactly was making it. Silk was, for the ancient Western world, a product without a clear origin, a material that seemed to arrive from the east the way rain arrives from the sky, through processes that were observed in their effects, but never in their mechanics. And the Ceres were the people who lived at the source. Or so the Romans believed. But who were they really? The simplest answer, the one found in most modern textbooks, is that the Ceres were the Chinese. The Han dynasty, which ruled China from 206 BC to 220 AD, was the dominant power in East Asia during the period when the term Ceres was most frequently used in Western sources, and China was, unquestionably, the original and primary producer of silk. The identification seems obvious. The Ceres made silk, the Chinese made silk, therefore the Ceres were the Chinese. But the ancient sources themselves are far less certain than this equation suggests, and their confusion is revealing. Consider what the Roman writers actually say about the Ceres. Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century AD, describes them as tall, red-haired, and blue-eyed, a description that matches no known population in China, but that could conceivably describe peoples of Central Asia, the Tarim Basin, or the steppe regions that lay between the Mediterranean world and the Chinese heartland. Pomponius Mela places them vaguely between India and the Scythians. Strabo associates them with the peoples of Central Asia, and Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, describes the land of the Ceres as bounded by vast deserts and surrounded by walls, details that could refer to the Tarim Basin oasis states as easily as to China proper. The problem is one of distance and intermediaries. No Roman writer is known to have visited China. No Roman merchant is documented as having completed the full journey from the Mediterranean to the Chinese capital. The goods that arrived in Roman markets had passed through multiple hands: Parthian, Sogdian, Kushan, and others, each adding a layer of markup and a layer of obscurity. By the time a bolt of silk reached a Roman market, the information attached to it about its origin had been filtered through so many intermediaries that it bore roughly the same relationship to reality as a rumor passed through a dozen retellings. This has led some scholars to propose a more nuanced reading, that the sayers of Greek and Roman texts were not the Chinese at all, but the intermediary peoples who controlled the silk trade's final stages, the Sogdians perhaps, or the inhabitants of the Tarim Basin oasis kingdoms like Khotan and Kashgar, where silk was not only traded, but also produced locally, using techniques that had spread westward from China centuries before Rome became a major consumer. Under this reading, the Ceres were real, and they really did produce silk. But they were not the people modern readers assume them to be. They were the middlemen, the last link in the chain that the Western world could see, mistaken for the source because no one from the West ever traveled far enough to see beyond them. There is another layer to the confusion. Chinese sources from the same period describe a distant Western land they called Dakin, usually identified with the Roman Empire. The descriptions are similarly vague, similarly filtered through intermediaries, and similarly prone to mixing fact with fantasy. The Chinese knew that Dakin produced glass, coral, and fine textiles. They knew it lay far to the west, beyond Parthia. But their understanding of Rome was no more precise than Rome's understanding of them. Two of the largest, most sophisticated civilizations on Earth existed simultaneously for centuries, traded with each other continuously, and yet never managed to develop an accurate picture of who the other actually was. One of the most intriguing episodes in this long history of mutual misunderstanding is the account of Gan Ying, a Chinese envoy sent westward in 97 AD with instructions to reach Dakin and establish direct contact. Gan Ying traveled as far as the Persian Gulf, further west than any documented Chinese traveler before him, but was reportedly dissuaded from continuing by Parthian sailors who told him the sea voyage to Rome was long, dangerous, and could take 2 years. He turned back. Whether the Parthians were telling the truth or deliberately discouraging a connection that would have bypassed their lucrative role as middlemen is a question historians have debated ever since. If Gan Ying had completed his journey, the mutual mystery between Rome and China might have been resolved 2,000 years ago. Instead, the fog persisted. The Romans continued to buy silk from people they called the Ceres, imagining them as a distant, peaceful, industrious civilization living somewhere beyond the mountains. The Chinese continued to hear reports of Dakin, imagining it as a kind of mirror image of their own empire far to the west. And the peoples in between, the Sogdians, the Kushans, the oasis dwellers of the Tarim Basin, continued to profit from the fact that neither end of the road could see the other clearly. The silk still moved. The caravans still crossed the mountains. But the question of who the Ceres really were, whether they were the Chinese as we understand them, or the Central Asian peoples who stood in their shadow, or some combination of both, shifting over time as trade routes shifted and kingdoms rose and fell, was never resolved in antiquity. And in a strange way, it has never been fully resolved since. The name Ceres sits in the ancient texts like a label on a package that has been opened, emptied, and refilled so many times that no one is quite sure what it originally contained. Two civilizations, separated by thousands of kilometers, trading with each other for centuries, and yet never managing to see each other clearly. But sometimes, The failure of understanding doesn't require an ocean or a desert. Sometimes it happens within a single life, a man who belongs to two worlds, trusted by both, and ultimately destroyed not by the enemies he fought but by the people he called his own. The forests of northern Germany are not what most people picture when they think of the ancient world. There are no marble columns here, no sun-baked plazas, no Mediterranean light. Instead, the landscape is dense, heavy, green, thick stands of oak and beech closing in on narrow valleys where streams run brown with tannin, and the ground stays damp even in summer. In the autumn of 9 AD, this forest became the site of one of the most devastating military disasters in Roman history. And the man who engineered it was, by every formal measure, a Roman himself. His name in the Latin sources was Arminius. He was born around 18 BC into the aristocracy of the Cherusci, a Germanic tribe living in the lowlands and forests east of the Rhine. As a young man, he was taken to Rome, whether as a hostage, a diplomatic ward, or part of a broader arrangement between the Cherusci and the empire is not entirely clear. And there he received a Roman education, Roman military training, and eventually Roman citizenship and the rank of equestrian. He served in the Roman auxiliary forces, commanding Germanic troops in Roman campaigns. He learned how legions marched, how they made camp, how they organized their supply lines, and where, in the dense forests of his homeland, those formations would be most vulnerable. And then he went home and used everything he had learned to destroy them. The Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, or more accurately, the ambush, since battle implies a contest that was never really in doubt, unfolded over 3 days as Arminius led a coalition of Germanic tribes against 3 Roman legions under the command of Publius Quinctilius Varus. The legions were strung out along a narrow forest track, weighed down by baggage, slowed by rain, and completely unprepared for an attack from a man Varus considered an ally. By the time it was over, approximately 15 to 20,000 Roman soldiers were dead. The eagle standards of 3 legions, the Sixtine, 16, and 19, were captured. Varus himself fell on his sword, and the Roman Empire's expansion into Germania east of the Rhine was, for all practical purposes, finished. The impact was enormous. The Emperor Augustus, according to the historian Suetonius, was so shaken by the news that he would bang his head against the door and cry out, "Quinctilius Varus, give me back my legions." The defeat reshaped the boundary of the Roman world for centuries. The Rhine, not the Elbe, became the empire's northern frontier, a line that held with modifications for the next 400 years. And Arminius, the man who drew that line, became the most significant military figure in Germanic history, celebrated in later centuries as a symbol of resistance, independence, and national identity. But what happened to Arminius after his greatest victory is a story that darkens with every chapter. The years following the Teutoburg Forest were not a simple triumph. Arminius had united a coalition of tribes for the ambush, but holding that coalition together proved far more difficult than assembling it. Germanic tribal politics were fractious, personal, and driven by rivalries that predated Rome's arrival and would long outlast it. Arminius's own family was divided. His father-in-law Segestes had opposed the rebellion from the beginning and remained loyal to Rome, eventually handing over Arminius's pregnant wife, Thusnelda, to the Roman general Germanicus. She was taken to Rome, where she gave birth to a son, Thumelicus, who was raised in captivity. Arminius never saw either of them again. Germanicus himself launched a series of retaliatory campaigns into Germania between 14 and 16 AD, fighting Arminius in several engagements that were costly for both sides, but ultimately inconclusive. The Romans recovered 2 of the 3 lost eagle standards. They visited the site of the Teutoburg disaster and buried the remains of the dead. But they did not break Arminius's power, and eventually the Emperor Tiberius, calculating that the cost of conquest outweighed the benefit, recalled Germanicus and abandoned the effort to subjugate the lands east of the Rhine. Arminius had survived Rome's revenge. He had maintained his position as the foremost leader among the Cherusci. He had, by any reasonable assessment, won. And then, in 21 AD, he was killed, not by Romans, not in battle, but by members of his own tribe. The Roman historian Tacitus, our primary source for this period, describes the death in a single compressed passage. Arminius, he writes, was assailed by treachery from his relatives after being accused of aspiring to kingship, a charge that in the fiercely egalitarian politics of the Germanic tribes was among the most dangerous that could be leveled against a leader. The implication is clear. The same qualities that made Arminius effective against Rome, his ability to command, to organize, to impose his will across tribal boundaries, made him threatening to the men who had once followed him. A war leader who wins too decisively, who accumulates too much prestige, who begins to look less like a first among equals and more like a king, becomes a target in a society where kingship itself is regarded with suspicion. But Tacitus's account raises as many questions as it answers. Who, specifically, killed him? Tacitus says relatives, but names no one. Was it a coordinated assassination planned by a faction within the Cherushi, or a more spontaneous act, a dispute that escalated, a confrontation that turned violent? Was Segestes involved, even indirectly, using his Roman connections to encourage the removal of a son-in-law who had caused him nothing but trouble? Or were the killers acting entirely on their own, motivated by personal grievances that the surviving sources don't record? And what happened to Arminius's body? Tacitus doesn't say. No burial site is mentioned. No tomb, no monument, no marker of any kind has ever been identified. The man who inflicted one of the greatest defeats in Roman military history, who changed the political geography of Europe, who was celebrated by Tacitus himself as the liberator of Germania. That man has no grave, or at least none that anyone has found. In the 19th century, a colossal monument was erected near Detmold in the Teutoburg forest. The Hermannstenkmal, a massive copper statue of a warrior raising a sword toward the sky. But the monument marks an idea, not a place. It was built nearly 2,000 years after the events it commemorates, and its location was chosen for visibility, not accuracy. Where Arminius actually fell, and where his body came to rest, remains unknown. There is a final detail worth considering, a small one, easily overlooked, but suggestive. Tacitus mentions that Arminius was 37 years old when he died, and that he was still the subject of songs among the barbarian peoples, songs that Tacitus himself acknowledges he cannot access, because they were composed in languages the Roman literary tradition did not preserve. Those songs, whatever they contained, details of the ambush, the battles with Germanicus, the betrayal, the death, were the Germanic version of the story, told by the people who knew him, in their own words, from their own perspective. They would have answered questions that Tacitus could not, and they are gone, not written down, not translated, not preserved in any archive or monastery or manuscript that has survived to the present day. So the man who stopped Rome at the forest's edge exists now only in the words of the civilization he defeated, described by his enemies, mourned by no surviving text in his own language, buried in a place no one can find. The forest still stands, thick and green and quiet. The streams still run, and somewhere beneath the roots and the centuries of accumulated silence, the story of Arminius continues, not in the version Rome told, but in the one his own people sang, and then, over the long centuries that followed, allowed to fade into the sound of wind moving through trees that have grown and fallen and grown again since the last person alive remembered the words. Songs that were never written down, a grave that was never found, a story told by the very people who had reason to tell it in their own favor. The fate of Arminius reminds us that even the most consequential lives can slip through the cracks of history when the civilization that remembers them relies on memory rather than manuscript. But there are places in the ancient world where the problem is even more acute, where entire kingdoms existed, minted coins, waged wars, built cities, and governed millions of people, and yet left behind so little in the way of written records, that reconstructing their history feels less like scholarship and more like archaeology of the imagination. The landscape begins in the mountain passes of eastern Afghanistan, narrow defiles where the wind funnels between walls of bare, fractured rock, opening suddenly into broad valleys where rivers fed by snowmelt turn the ground green in spring and brown again by autumn. Follow those rivers south and east, down through the Khyber Pass and the plains beyond, and you enter a region that, 2,000 years ago, was one of the most politically complex places on Earth. A crossroads where Greek, Persian, Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese influences collided, overlapped, and produced kingdoms that belonged fully to none of those traditions, and borrowed freely from all of them. It was here, in the borderlands between modern Afghanistan, Pakistan, and northwestern India, that a dynasty known to modern historians as the Indo-Parthians established a kingdom sometime in the 1st century BC. Their origins lay in the Parthian Empire, the great Iranian power that controlled the territory from Mesopotamia to Central Asia, and that Rome regarded as its most formidable eastern rival. But the Indo-Parthians were not simply Parthian governors ruling a distant province. They were an independent or semi-independent dynasty, issuing their own coinage, maintaining their own court, and governing a territory that, at its greatest extent, stretched from the city of Kabul to the lower Indus Valley, a domain encompassing some of the most strategically and commercially significant land in the ancient world. The most famous of their kings was a man named Gondophares, who ruled in the 1st century AD, and whose name echoes in one of the more unexpected corners of Western literature. In the apocryphal Acts of Thomas, a Christian text probably composed in the 3rd century, the Apostle Thomas travels to India and arrives at the court of a king called Gondophares, where he is commissioned to build a palace and instead gives the money to the poor, telling the king his palace is being built in heaven. For centuries, scholars dismissed Gondophares as a fictional creation, until the 19th century, when coins bearing the name Gondophares began turning up in Afghanistan and Pakistan, confirming that the king was real, that he ruled in roughly the right period, and that the story, however embellished, was attached to an actual historical figure. It was a remarkable confirmation, but it also highlighted, by contrast, how little else we know. The Indo-Parthian kingdom is reconstructed almost entirely from coins. Thousands of them have been found, silver, drachms, and copper denominations bearing the names and portraits of kings, many of them otherwise completely unknown. The coins show rulers in Parthian-style dress, sometimes with Greek inscriptions on one side and Kharoshthi script on the other, reflecting the multilingual, multicultural character of the kingdom. From these coins, numismatists have assembled a rough sequence of rulers: Gondophares, followed by Abdagasses, Sassis, Pecores, and others whose relationships to one another, father and son, uncle and nephew, rivals, co-regents, remain largely a matter of educated guesswork. Beyond the coins, the evidence thins dramatically. A handful of inscriptions have been found, most notably the Takhti-Bahi inscription, a stone tablet from a Buddhist monastery in what is now northwestern Pakistan, which provides a date in the reign of Gondophares and has been crucial for anchoring the kingdom's chronology. A few scattered references in Indian and Chinese sources mention rulers or territories that may correspond to the Indo-Parthians, and archaeological sites in the region, Taxila, Bagram, Kabul, contain layers of occupation that span the relevant period, though disentangling the Indo-Parthian layers from those of the Indo-Greeks before them and the Kushans after them is painstakingly difficult. What is almost entirely absent is any kind of narrative history. No court chronicle survives, no administrative records have been found, no letters, no legal documents, no diplomatic correspondence, nothing that would tell us how the kingdom was governed, how its rulers related to the Parthian Empire to the west, how they managed the transition between Greek and Indian cultural traditions, or how they responded to the rising power of the Kushans, who would eventually absorb their territory in the 2nd century AD. This silence is not simply a matter of documents being lost. It raises a more fundamental question. Did the Indo-Parthians produce the kind of written records that could be lost in the first place? The Parthian Empire itself is notoriously underdocumented compared to its predecessors and successors. The Achaemenid Persians left inscriptions carved in stone at Persepolis and Behistun. The Sasanians who followed the Parthians left rock reliefs, royal chronicles, and administrative archives. The Parthians, by contrast, governed a vast empire for nearly 5 centuries and left behind comparatively little in the way of monumental inscriptions or literary texts in their own language. If the Parthian heartland itself is a documentary desert, it is perhaps not surprising that a Parthian successor state on the empire's eastern frontier would be even more so. But there are hints that more once existed. The Acts of Thomas, whatever its literary merits, presupposes a level of knowledge about the Indo-Parthian court, its location, its ruler's name, its customs, that suggests information was circulating in the eastern Mediterranean about this distant kingdom, at least in the early centuries AD. Chinese sources from the Han dynasty mention kingdoms in the region that may correspond to Indo-Parthian territory, describing trade goods, political relationships, and military capabilities in enough detail to suggest that diplomatic or commercial contact was ongoing. And Indian literary traditions, particularly Buddhist texts, contain references to foreign kings and patrons in the northwest that some scholars have tentatively linked to the Indo-Parthian dynasty. If information about the Indo-Parthians was circulating in 3 different literary traditions, Christian, Chinese, and Indian, then the kingdom was not invisible to the ancient world. It was simply invisible in the way that matters most for modern historians. It left no account of itself, in its own voice, in a form that has survived. Some researchers have speculated that the Indo-Parthians, like many kingdoms in this region, may have kept records on perishable materials, birch bark, palm leaves, leather, or wooden tablets, that simply did not survive the centuries of warfare, conquest, and environmental degradation that followed. The Gandharan Buddhist manuscripts discovered in recent decades, written on birch bark scrolls and preserved only by the dry conditions of the Afghan-Pakistani borderlands, offer a tantalizing parallel. An entire literary tradition that survived only because a few scrolls happened to end up in sealed containers in arid caves. If secular administrative documents existed on similar materials, their chances of survival would have been far lower, stored not in sealed jars but in government buildings, palaces, and archives that were sacked, burned, and rebuilt by each successive power that claimed the region. There is also the possibility, raised cautiously by a few scholars, that the Indo-Parthians did leave inscriptions or monuments that have simply not been found yet, or that have been found but not recognized for what they are. The archaeology of Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan has been severely disrupted by decades of conflict, and vast areas that would be of enormous interest to historians remain inaccessible to systematic survey. Sites that were partially excavated in the 19th and early 20th centuries were often recorded with methods that would not meet modern standards, and collections of artifacts were dispersed, mislabeled, or lost in the upheavals that followed. It is entirely possible that evidence of the Indo-Parthian kingdom, inscriptions, documents, architectural remains, is sitting in a museum storeroom, a private collection, or an unexcavated site, waiting for the moment when someone with the right knowledge and the right access happens to look in the right place. Until then, the Indo-Parthian kingdom remains what it has been for centuries. A dynasty known almost entirely through the small, round, stamped pieces of metal its rulers pressed into the hands of their subjects. Each coin is a fragment of a statement, a name, a title, a face, a claim to authority. But the full statement, the story those rulers would have told about themselves, their origins, their ambitions, their world, has not yet been heard. The coins circulate through auction houses and museum catalogs, passed from hand to hand much as they were 2,000 years ago, still carrying the names of kings whose stories remain, for now, locked in the silence of a kingdom that has not yet found its voice. A kingdom known only through its coins, rulers whose names survive, but whose words do not. It is a particular kind of loss, one that leaves you holding evidence of a civilization's existence without any access to its thoughts. But what if the loss went the other direction? What if it wasn't a kingdom's records that vanished, but its ideas, its scientific discoveries, its medical breakthroughs, its accumulated understanding of the natural world, destroyed not by conquest or neglect, but by a single night of fire? The ruins of Pergamon rise from a steep rocky acropolis in western Turkey, overlooking a broad valley where the Bakirçay River winds through fields of cotton and tobacco. Even in their broken state, the terraces and foundations convey a sense of ambition that few ancient cities can match. Temples, palaces, a theater carved into the hillside with seating for 10,000, and, most significantly for our story, the remains of a library that was once considered the second greatest in the ancient world, surpassed only by the Great Library of Alexandria itself. The Library of Pergamon was founded by the Attalid dynasty, the Hellenistic kings who ruled this corner of Asia Minor from the 3rd to the 2nd century BC. According to ancient tradition, it held approximately 200,000 scrolls, a figure that, even if exaggerated, places it among the largest repositories of knowledge in antiquity. The Attalids were aggressive collectors, competing directly with the Ptolemies of Egypt for manuscripts, scholars, and intellectual prestige. The rivalry was reportedly so intense that Egypt at one point banned the export of papyrus to Pergamon, hoping to starve its competitor of writing material. The Pergamenes responded by developing an alternative: parchment, made from animal skin, a material so closely associated with the city that its Latin name, Pergamena, derives directly from it. The library attracted scholars from across the Greek-speaking world, philosophers, grammarians, mathematicians, and crucially, scientists and physicians. Pergamon became a center not only for the preservation of existing knowledge, but for the production of new work, particularly in the fields of medicine and anatomy. It was here, centuries after the library's founding, that one of the most influential scientists in human history would conduct much of his early career. Galen of Pergamon, born around 129 AD, became the ancient world's most prolific medical writer, a physician whose theories about the human body would dominate Western and Islamic medicine for more than 1,000 years. He wrote on anatomy, physiology, pharmacology, surgery, philosophy, and logic, producing a body of work so vast that cataloging it became a project in itself. Ancient sources attribute to him somewhere between 400 and 600 individual treatises. He dissected animals, treated gladiators, served as personal physician to the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and recorded his findings with a precision and thoroughness that remained unmatched until the Renaissance. But a significant portion of Galen's work is gone. In 192 AD, a devastating fire swept through a section of Rome that included the Temple of Peace, where Galen had stored a large collection of his own manuscripts, finished works, drafts, notes, and, critically, copies of rare texts by earlier physicians and scientists that he had gathered over decades. Galen himself wrote about the loss in a short treatise titled On the Avoidance of Grief, discovered only in 2005 in a manuscript found in a Greek monastery in Thessaloniki. In it, he describes the destruction with a restraint that barely conceals the scale of the catastrophe. Not only his own writings were lost, but also his collection of earlier medical and pharmaceutical texts, works by physicians whose names survive only because Galen quoted them, and whose original manuscripts, stored in the same warehouse, burned that night and have never been recovered. Consider what that means. Galen was not merely a writer, he was a curator. He had spent years assembling copies of works by earlier medical authorities, Herophilus, Aristides, and others who had conducted groundbreaking anatomical research at Alexandria centuries before, including what are believed to have been the only systematic human dissections performed in the ancient world. Those earlier researchers had described the nervous system, the circulatory system, and the structure of the brain with a level of detail that would not be achieved again for more than a millennium. Their original works had already become rare by Galen's time. He collected what he could, annotated it, cross-referenced it with his own findings, and stored it in what he believed was a safe location. And then, in a single fire, centuries of accumulated medical knowledge, Galen's own contributions and the earlier works he had preserved, were reduced to ash. What survived did so because copies existed elsewhere, in other libraries, in private collections, in the hands of students and correspondents scattered across the Roman world. But the survival was uneven. Some of Galen's major works came through intact. Others survived only in Arabic translation, preserved by Islamic scholars during the medieval period when the Greek originals were lost in Europe. Still others are known only by title, listed in Galen's own catalog of his works, but never found in any manuscript tradition, Greek, Arabic, or otherwise. They exist as names on a list, entries in a bibliography, pointing to texts that once contained ideas about medicine, anatomy, and the natural world that no living person has read. The works of the earlier Alexandrian anatomists, Herophilus and Aristides, fared even worse. Almost nothing survives in their own words. What we know of their discoveries comes almost entirely from later writers, Galen chief among them, who quoted, paraphrased, and sometimes argued with their findings. But Galen's quotations are selective. He cited what was relevant to his own arguments, not what was relevant to theirs. The full scope of what Herophilus discovered about the brain, or what Aristides understood about the heart and blood vessels, is something we can only estimate based on fragments filtered through another man's agenda. And here the mystery connects back to Pergamon itself. The great library of the Attalids, according to one of the most famous and debated stories in ancient literary history, was given to Cleopatra by Mark Antony in the 1st century BC. Its entire collection supposedly transferred to Alexandria to replenish the losses that library had suffered in an earlier fire. If this account reported by Plutarch is accurate, then the scientific and medical texts that had been accumulated at Pergamon over 2 centuries were moved to Alexandria, where they would eventually share the fate of that library's own collections, a fate that remains one of the most contested questions in the history of knowledge, debated endlessly with regard to when, how, and how completely the Alexandrian collections were ultimately destroyed. But some scholars have questioned whether the transfer ever happened at all, or whether it was as complete as Plutarch implies. Could copies have remained at Pergamon? Could individual scholars have retained personal collections that were never included in the transfer? The city continued to function as an intellectual center well into the Roman period. Galen himself grew up there, trained there, and presumably had access to local libraries and collections during his formative years. If Pergamon's library had been entirely emptied centuries before his birth, what was he reading? The answer may be that Pergamon's intellectual legacy was never concentrated in a single building. Libraries in the ancient world were not monolithic institutions in the modern sense. They were networks, collections held by temples, schools, private individuals, and professional guilds, loosely connected and constantly exchanging copies. The Library of Pergamon may have been the largest node in a network that included dozens of smaller collections scattered across the city and the surrounding region. When the main library was transferred, or taken, or diminished, those smaller collections may have persisted, preserving some of what the central library lost, until they too eventually succumbed to the usual enemies of ancient texts: fire, damp, insects, conquest, and the slow, quiet indifference of centuries in which no one thought to make another copy. Somewhere in that chain of losses, from Pergamon to Alexandria, to Rome, to fire, to silence, scientific works that described the structure of the human body, the properties of drugs, the mechanics of disease, and the foundations of rational medicine passed out of human knowledge. Some were recovered, centuries later, through Arabic translations made by scholars who recognized their value when Europe had forgotten it. Others have never been found in any form. They remain entries on a list, titles in a catalog, evidence that someone once knew something that no one knows now, and that the distance between knowledge and oblivion can be measured, sometimes, in the time it takes for a warehouse to burn, A warehouse burns in Rome, and centuries of medical knowledge vanish in a single night. But fire is not the only element that can swallow the records of the ancient world. Sometimes it is water, rising slowly, silently, year after year, filling the chambers where the most sacred words were spoken, sealing them beneath a surface that reflects nothing back. Less than 150 kilometers south of Pergamon, in a low-lying valley near the Aegean coast of Turkey, a narrow path leads through a grove of trees to a place that most visitors to the ancient world have never heard of. There are no dramatic clifftop ruins here, no towering columns visible from a distance. Instead, the ground dips, the vegetation thickens, and the remains of a temple complex emerge gradually from the earth. Half-excavated, partially flooded, its lowest chambers still filled with the groundwater that has been rising through this valley for centuries. This is Claros, and for more than 1,000 years it was one of the most important oracles in the ancient world. A place where cities, kings, and emperors sent delegations to hear the voice of Apollo, and where the god's answers were spoken in verse from a chamber so deep underground that the priest who delivered them could not see the sky. The oracle at Claros was ancient even by ancient standards. Literary tradition traced its origins to the mythological period, linking it to the seer Mopsus and to the earliest Greek settlements on the coast of Asia Minor. By the Archaic period, it was already well established, mentioned by poets and historians as a center of prophecy rivaling Delphi and Didyma. But it was during the Roman imperial period, the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, that Claros reached the height of its influence, attracting delegations from cities across Asia Minor, the Black Sea coast, North Africa, and even distant provinces of the empire that had little previous connection to Greek religious traditions. We know this because of inscriptions. The approach to the temple at Claros was lined with monuments erected by the cities that sent delegations, stone bases bearing the names of the cities, the members of the delegations, and, occasionally, fragments of the questions they came to ask. Additional inscriptions have been found at sites throughout the ancient world, in cities across modern Turkey, in North Africa, in the Balkans, recording the oracle's responses, which were carried home and displayed publicly as evidence of divine guidance. From these inscriptions, archaeologists have assembled a remarkably detailed picture of the oracle's reach and prestige. Hundreds of cities consulted Claros. Delegations arrived regularly, sometimes annually. The oracle was, by the 2nd century AD, one of the busiest religious institutions in the Roman world. And yet, despite all of this evidence of activity, the actual content of the oracle's pronouncements, the words spoken in the underground chamber, the prophecies that cities traveled hundreds of kilometers to receive, has almost entirely disappeared. This is the paradox at the heart of Claros. We know who came. We know how often they came. We know the elaborate ritual they followed, descending into the earth through a series of corridors and antechambers, passing through increasingly narrow and dark passages until they reached the Adyton, the innermost sanctum, where the prophet, a male priest who was often said to be illiterate, drank from a sacred spring and then delivered the oracle's response in hexameter verse, sometimes of considerable literary quality. The responses were transcribed, presumably by the Thespiodos and other attendant priests, and copies were given to the delegation to carry home. But the archive, the collection of questions asked and answers given, accumulated over centuries of continuous operation, has never been found. The excavations at Claros, begun by French archaeologists in the 1950s and continuing intermittently to the present day, have revealed the physical structure of the oracle in extraordinary detail. The underground passages are still there, narrow, dark, built of massive stone blocks, descending to a chamber where the sacred spring still flows, filling the lowest rooms with clear, cold water. The architecture is designed to produce an experience of descent, of transition from the ordinary world above to something deeper and older below. Walking through these passages, even today with the water rising around your ankles and the light from the entrance fading behind you, it is not difficult to understand why the ancients believed they were approaching the threshold of the divine. But the rooms are empty. No scrolls, no tablets, no shelves. Whatever records were kept at Claros, and the scale of the operation strongly suggests that records were kept, if only for the practical purpose of managing the flow of delegations and tracking the responses given. They are gone. Where did they go? The most straightforward explanation is that they were stored on perishable materials, papyrus or parchment, and simply did not survive the centuries of flooding, abandonment, and environmental degradation that followed the oracle's closure. The valley in which Claros sits is low, wet, and prone to alluvial deposits. The water table has risen significantly since antiquity, and the lower chambers of the temple have been submerged for centuries. Any organic material stored in these conditions would have been destroyed long ago. But there is another possibility, one that the inscriptions themselves hint at. If copies of the oracle's responses were routinely sent home with delegations and displayed publicly in their cities of origin, then the archive of Claros was never concentrated in a single location. It was distributed, scattered across hundreds of cities throughout the ancient world, carved in stone or written on documents that were stored locally. Under this reading, the archive of Claros still exists, in theory, not as a single collection in one place, but as fragments dispersed across the ruins of every city that ever sent a delegation. Every inscription found in a distant city recording an oracle from Claros is a piece of that archive, recovered one fragment at a time. The problem is that most of those inscriptions record only the response, not the question, and the response, stripped of its context, is often cryptic to the point of opacity. The oracle's answers were composed in verse, using the formulaic language of Greek religious poetry, full of references to gods, rituals, and cosmic forces that would have been meaningful to the original petitioners, but that are difficult to interpret without knowing what was asked. Reading these fragments is like hearing one side of a phone conversation. You can sense the shape of the exchange, but the substance remains just out of reach. And then there is the question of what the sacred spring itself might conceal. The water that fills the Adyton at Claros has never been fully pumped out. The lowest chambers have been only partially explored. French excavators in the 20th century made significant progress in clearing the passages and documenting the architecture, but the ongoing presence of water, combined with structural concerns about the stability of the underground chambers, has prevented a complete investigation. Some researchers have speculated, cautiously and without making claims that the evidence cannot support, that artifacts, offerings, or even inscribed tablets may still lie beneath the water level, preserved in the anaerobic conditions that sometimes allow organic and metallic materials to survive in waterlogged environments. It is an appealing thought. The oracle spoke from a chamber fed by a sacred spring. The spring is still flowing. The chamber is still there, still filled with the same water the prophet once drank before opening his mouth to deliver the words of a god. If records were stored in that chamber, or if offerings were deposited there by the delegations who came to consult the oracle, they may still be present, submerged, silted over, invisible from the surface, but physically intact. Whether this is true, or whether the water has long since dissolved whatever it once covered, is something only a future excavation can determine. For now, the oracle at Claros remains what it has been for 16 centuries, a place where questions were asked, answers were given, and the record of what passed between human and divine was entrusted to stone, water, and the uncertain mercy of time. The corridors still descend into the dark. The spring still rises. And somewhere in the silence between the last question asked and the first archaeologist's flashlight, the voice of Claros may yet have something left to say. An oracle that spoke from beneath the earth, its words carried home by delegations and carved into stone across the ancient world. But not all prophecies were delivered in person. Some were written down, committed to scrolls, sealed away, and guarded with a secrecy so absolute that even the civilization that depended on them never fully understood where they came from. The story begins, as so many Roman stories do, with a legend. An old woman, unnamed, unannounced, appearing from nowhere in particular, approaches the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, sometime in the late 6th century BC. She carries 9 books of prophecy, she says, and offers to sell them to him at a steep price. The king refuses. The woman burns 3 of the books and offers the remaining 6 at the same price. He refuses again. She burns 3 more and offers the final 3, still at the original price. This time, alarmed by the destruction of what might be irreplaceable knowledge, the king pays. The woman vanishes, and the 3 surviving books are placed in a stone vault beneath the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus on the Capitoline Hill, where they will remain under heavy guard for the next 4 centuries. These were the Sibylline books, the most sacred and most secret texts in the Roman state religion. The woman in the legend is identified as a Sibyl, specifically, in most versions, the Sibyl of Cumae, a prophetess associated with the Greek colony near modern Naples, where a cave complex still exists that ancient tradition identified as her dwelling place. But the concept of the Sibyl was far older and far more widespread than any single location. Ancient writers enumerated multiple Sibyls. The Roman scholar Varro counted 10, placing them at sites scattered across the Mediterranean and beyond: Cumae, Erythraean, Delphi, Libya, Persia, the Hellespont, Phrygia, and others. Each was described as an inspired woman, often of immense age, who delivered prophecies in a state of divine possession, speaking or writing in verse that was obscure, elusive, and subject to multiple interpretations. Who were these women? The question sounds simple. The answer is anything but. The historical existence of individual Sibyls has never been established. No birth record, no grave, no contemporary account written during any Sibyl's supposed lifetime has ever been found. The Sibyls exist entirely in retrospect, described by later writers who treat them as figures from a remote past, already ancient and already legendary by the time anyone thought to write about them. Heraclitus, in the 5th century BC, mentions the Sibyl in a fragment that treats her as a known figure, suggesting that the concept was already well established in the Greek world by that date. But whether he was referring to a real person, a class of prophetesses, or a literary archetype is impossible to determine from the surviving text. The books attributed to them are equally mysterious. The original Roman Sibylline books, the 3 purchased by Tarquinius, were not public texts. They were state secrets, stored underground, accessible only to a special priestly college, the Quindicum Viri Sacris Facundis, who consulted them exclusively at the Senate's request and only in times of national emergency. The books were not read for general guidance or personal prophecy. They were consulted when Rome faced existential threats: plague, military disaster, prodigies interpreted as signs of divine anger. And the priest's task was to find within the texts the specific ritual prescriptions needed to appease the gods. The content of the books was never published. No complete text was ever made public. What the books actually said remained, for the entirety of their existence, known only to a handful of men who were bound by oath not to reveal it. In 83 BC, the Temple of Jupiter burned, and the original Sibylline books were destroyed. The loss was treated as a catastrophe. The Roman Senate immediately authorized an effort to reassemble the collection, sending envoys to Greek cities across the Mediterranean, particularly to Erythraean and Asia Minor, where a local Sibylline tradition was well established, to gather prophetic texts that could serve as replacements. Additional material was collected from other sources: private collections, temple archives, and, inevitably, newly composed texts that were passed off as ancient originals. The replacement collection was assembled, edited, and installed in a new location, eventually the Temple of Apollo on the Palatine Hill, where Augustus housed them as part of his religious reforms. But here, the questions multiply. If the original books were secret, never published, never copied, never shown to anyone outside the priestly college, how would anyone have recognized authentic replacements? The envoys sent to collect substitute texts had no original to compare them against. They were, in effect, assembling a collection of prophecies based on reputation, tradition, and the claims of the communities that provided them. How much of the replacement collection was genuinely old? How much was recently composed, tailored to match Roman expectations of what Sibylline prophecy should sound like? And how much was simply invented by priests, by poets, by political figures who saw an opportunity to insert their own agendas into the most authoritative religious texts in the Roman world? Ancient writers were already suspicious. Cicero expressed skepticism about the Sibylline texts, noting that their prophecies were so vague and flexible that they could be made to fit almost any situation after the fact. Others observed that the replacement collection seemed to contain material suspiciously relevant to contemporary political debates, prophecies that conveniently supported the policies of whoever happened to be in power at the time. Augustus himself reportedly had the collection edited, removing texts he deemed spurious, a process that, depending on your perspective, was either a responsible act of curation or a politically motivated purge. The replacement collection survived until the early 5th century AD, when, according to tradition, the Roman general Stilicho ordered the books destroyed, either because he regarded them as a source of pagan resistance to Christianity, or for political reasons that the sources don't fully explain. With their destruction, the last physical remnants of the Sibylline tradition in Rome were gone. What survives today under the name Sibylline Oracles is something entirely different, a collection of texts composed primarily by Jewish and Christian writers between the 2nd century BC and the 7th century AD, using the Sibylline format as a vehicle for their own theological and apocalyptic messages. These later texts, while fascinating in their own right, have no direct connection to the original Roman collection. They borrowed the Sibyl's authority, her name, her voice, her reputation for ancient wisdom, but they are not the books that lay beneath the Temple of Jupiter. Those books, whatever they contained, are gone. And so we are left with a void at the center of one of Rome's most important religious institutions. For 4 centuries, the original Sibylline books guided the Roman state through its greatest crises, dictating rituals, introducing new gods, shaping religious policy at the highest level. The men who read them believed they were consulting texts of divine origin, written by a woman, or women, who had received their knowledge directly from Apollo. And yet no one today can say with certainty who wrote them, when they were composed, what they actually said, or whether the tradition that attributed them to a single prophetic figure conceals a more complicated and more interesting reality. A network of oracular communities scattered across the ancient Mediterranean, producing prophetic literature that was collected, compiled, and eventually claimed by a civilization that needed to believe it came from a single, divinely inspired source. The cave at Cumae still exists, a long trapezoidal corridor cut through volcanic rock, open at one end to the light and closed at the other by a wall of shadow. Visitors walk through it today in silence, listening to the echo of their own footsteps in a space where, according to the oldest traditions, a woman once sat and spoke words that would shape the fate of an empire. Who she was, if she was anyone at all, is a question the corridor does not answer. It only echoes. A corridor carved through rock, echoing with footsteps where a voice once spoke for a god. The Sibyl's cave at Cumae was a place where the divine was believed to break through into human experience. Uninvited, overwhelming, impossible to control. But in the ancient world, there was another way the gods were thought to communicate with mortals, not through the violent seizure of a prophet's body, but through something far quieter, far more intimate, and far stranger. They came in dreams. The ruins of the Asclepion at Pergamon spread across a gentle slope below the main Acropolis, a complex of colonnaded courtyards, treatment rooms, a theater, a library, and, at its heart, a series of chambers and underground passages designed for a single, remarkable purpose: to allow the sick to sleep in the presence of a god and receive in their dreams instructions for their own healing. The god was Asclepius, the divine physician, and his sanctuary at Pergamon was one of the most famous healing centers in the ancient world, a place where patients came from across the Roman Empire to undergo a practice known as incubation. Ritual sleep, performed in sacred space, with the expectation that the god would appear in the sleeper's dreams and prescribe a course of treatment. It was here, in the middle of the 2nd century AD, that a man named Aelius Aristides began keeping a record of his dreams, a project that would consume him for decades and produce one of the most extraordinary personal documents to survive from antiquity. Aristides was not a priest or a physician. He was an orator, one of the most celebrated public speakers in the Greek-speaking world, a man whose rhetorical skill earned him the patronage of emperors and the admiration of audiences from Athens to Rome. But in his late 20s, Aristides fell ill with a constellation of symptoms so persistent, so varied, and so resistant to conventional treatment that they came to dominate the rest of his life. Headaches, respiratory problems, digestive complaints, muscular pain, fevers, chills. The list is long, shifting, and difficult for modern physicians to diagnose at a distance of nearly 2,000 years. Some scholars have proposed chronic illness, others psychosomatic conditions, others a combination of physical and psychological factors that cannot be disentangled from the cultural context in which he experienced them. What is certain is that Aristides, after exhausting the resources of conventional medicine, turned to Asclepius, and that the god, as Aristides understood it, answered. The dreams began almost immediately upon his arrival at the Pergamon Asclepion. Asclepius appeared to him in visions that were vivid, detailed, and specific, prescribing treatments that ranged from the conventional to the bizarre: mud baths, barefoot running in winter, rivers swimming in freezing weather, fasting, purging, bloodletting, and, on at least one occasion, abstaining from bathing for years at a time. Aristides followed these instructions with absolute faith, recording each dream, each prescription, and each result in a personal journal that he maintained, according to his own account, for more than 2 decades. The surviving portion of this record is known as the Sacred Tales, 6 books written in Greek that describe Aristides' relationship with Asclepius in terms so intimate and so psychologically revealing that modern readers have compared them, not without justification, to the earliest forms of autobiography. Aristides describes not only his dreams, but his emotional responses to them. His fear, his gratitude, his moments of doubt, and his overwhelming sense of being personally chosen by a god who took an active, ongoing interest in his welfare. The Sacred Tales are, among other things, a portrait of religious experience from the inside, a first-person account of what it felt like to believe, with complete sincerity, that a divine being was communicating with you through the medium of sleep. But the Sacred Tales, as they survive, are not the complete record. Aristides himself makes clear that the 6 books represent a selection, a curated summary drawn from a much larger body of raw material. He refers repeatedly to his dream diaries, the daily journals in which he recorded each night's visions as soon as he woke, before the details could fade. These diaries, he says, filled many volumes. They contained not only the dreams that made it into the Sacred Tales, but hundreds of others, dreams that dealt with matters beyond his health, dreams that touched on politics, philosophy, personal relationships, and the inner workings of the Asclepion itself. He describes consulting these diaries while composing the Sacred Tales, selecting certain episodes and passing over others, shaping a narrative from what was originally a raw, unedited stream of nightly experience. Those diaries have never been found. The loss is significant for reasons that go beyond the biography of a single man. Aristides was not the only person practicing incubation at the Pergamon Asclepion. The sanctuary treated thousands of patients over centuries, each one presumably experiencing dreams of their own, some of which may have been recorded, discussed with priests, or incorporated into the sanctuary's therapeutic protocols. Aristides' diaries, had they survived, would have offered an unprecedented window not only into one man's dream life, but into the culture of dream interpretation that surrounded him. The techniques the priests used to elicit meaningful dreams, the theological frameworks within which those dreams were understood, and the practical medical outcomes that resulted from treatments prescribed in visions. Some scholars have speculated that the Asclepion itself maintained records of its patients' dreams, a kind of institutional archive that would have allowed the priests to identify patterns, track the effectiveness of dream-prescribed treatments, and refine their methods over time. Evidence from other Asclepia supports this idea. At Epidaurus, the oldest and most prestigious of the Asclepian sanctuaries, inscribed tablets have been found recording the dreams and miraculous cures of patients in what appears to be a systematic, catalog-like format. If the Pergamon Asclepion maintained similar records, and given its size, prestige, and the sophistication of its medical practice, it almost certainly did, those records would represent something extraordinary. A database of dreams compiled over centuries, organized by symptom, treatment, and outcome, constituting one of the ancient world's most ambitious attempts to systematize subjective human experience. No such archive has been found at Pergamon. The Asclepion has been extensively excavated, revealing the architecture of the complex in remarkable detail. The sacred spring, the treatment tunnels, the theater where patients were entertained as part of their therapy, the library where they could read during their recovery. But the rooms are empty of documents. Whatever was written there, Aristides' diaries, the priest's records, the accumulated case histories of centuries of dream-based medicine, has not survived in any form that archaeologists have been able to identify. The usual explanations apply: perishable materials, environmental degradation, the long centuries of abandonment during which the sanctuary fell into disuse, and its contents were scattered, reused, or destroyed. The rise of Christianity, which regarded the cult of Asclepius with particular hostility, seeing in it a pagan competitor to Christ's own healing miracles, may have accelerated the process. Temples were closed, converted, or demolished. Libraries were dispersed. Records that documented the efficacy of pagan healing practices would have had few advocates in a world that increasingly regarded such practices as demonic rather than divine. But there is a quieter possibility too, one worth considering, even if it cannot be confirmed. Aristides was not the only ancient writer to keep a dream diary. The practice was recommended by philosophers, physicians, and religious teachers across the ancient world. Marcus Aurelius, Aristides' near contemporary, alludes to receiving medical prescriptions in dreams. The physician Galen, who trained at Pergamon and would have been familiar with the Asclepion's practices, describes dreams as diagnostically significant and worth recording. If dream journaling was a widespread practice among educated people in the Roman world, then the loss is not of a single diary, but of an entire genre, a body of first-person psychological documentation that existed in private collections, personal libraries, and household archives across the ancient Mediterranean. And that vanished not because it was concentrated in one place that burned or flooded, but because it was dispersed across thousands of private lives, each copy surviving only as long as someone in the household thought it worth keeping. The Asclepion at Pergamon is quiet now, its courtyards open to the sky, its tunnels leading into cool, dark spaces where the air is still, and the sound of water can sometimes be heard below the floor. People still visit. They walk the same paths the patients walked, pass through the same corridors, stand in the same rooms where, 2,000 years ago, men and women lay down in the dark, closed their eyes, and waited for a god to speak. What those sleepers heard, what they saw, what they felt, what they wrote down the next morning in handwriting still unsteady from sleep, is something the ruins can suggest but no longer confirm. The dreams happened, the diaries were kept, and then, like the dreams themselves, they faded, not all at once, but gradually, slipping from memory as the last person who remembered them closed their eyes for a final time and did not wake to write anything down. Dreams recorded and lost, visions committed to paper and then allowed to dissolve into the same silence from which they emerged. But there is something arguably more disorienting than a real document that has disappeared. And that is a document that has survived, that sits on library shelves and in digitized databases, available to anyone who wants to read it, and that no one, after more than a century of intensive scholarship, can fully trust. Picture a manuscript, Not ancient, but medieval, a copy of a copy of a copy, written in Latin on parchment in a monastic scriptorium sometime in the 9th or 10th century. The text it preserves claims to be something far older, a collection of imperial biographies covering the Roman emperors from Hadrian to Marinus, roughly 117 to 284 AD, a turbulent stretch of history that includes some of Rome's greatest rulers and some of its most obscure. The work is attributed to 6 different authors, writing during the reigns of Diocletian and Constantine, and it presents itself as a straightforward continuation of the tradition established by Suetonius and other earlier biographers. This is the Historia Augusta, and it is one of the most baffling documents in the entire corpus of ancient literature. The problem is not that the text is lost. It isn't. Multiple manuscripts survive. The problem is that the text is, to a degree that scholars have spent generations trying to determine, a fabrication. Not a simple forgery, not a document composed wholesale by someone pretending to be someone else, but something more subtle and more troubling. A text that blends genuine historical information with invented characters, fabricated documents, fictional speeches, and imaginary sources so seamlessly that separating the real from the false has become one of the most intractable puzzles in classical scholarship. The 6 authors whose names appear in the text, Aelius Spartianus, Julius Capitolinus, Vocatus Gallicanus, Aelius Lampridius, Trebellius Pollio, and Flavius Vopiscus, are themselves objects of suspicion. Most modern scholars believe that all 6 are pseudonyms, and that the entire work was composed by a single anonymous author writing in the late 4th century AD, decades after the period the text claims to represent. The evidence for this is cumulative rather than decisive. Similarities in vocabulary and style across the supposedly different authors, anachronisms that place certain passages later than their claimed date of composition, and, most damningly, the fabrication of sources that can be shown never to have existed. Letters attributed to emperors that contradict known facts, quotations from historians whose names appear nowhere else in the ancient record, and references to documents that bear all the hallmarks of literary invention. But it is the invented people who are the most unsettling. The Historia Augusta contains biographies of emperors and usurpers who are well attested in other sources: Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius, Septimius Severus, Aurelian. These biographies, while often unreliable in detail, clearly describe real historical figures and draw on genuine, if sometimes garbled, historical information. Alongside these, however, the text includes accounts of figures whose existence is far less certain: minor usurpers, provincial pretenders, and short-lived claimants to the throne who appear in the Historia Augusta and nowhere else. The section on the so-called 30 tyrants, a deliberate echo of the 30 tyrants of Athens, which the author openly acknowledges, lists supposed usurpers who rose against the Emperor Gallienus in the chaotic 3rd century AD. Some of these figures are confirmed by coins, inscriptions, or references in other sources. Others appear in no other text, left no archaeological trace, and possess biographies that read more like literary exercises than historical accounts. Did these people exist? For some, the answer is almost certainly no. The usurper Saturninus, for example, is given a biography that contains details suspiciously similar to those of other, better documented figures, as though the author had assembled a plausible-seeming life from spare parts borrowed from elsewhere. Others are harder to dismiss. A figure who appears only in the Historia Augusta might be fictional, or might be a real person who happened to leave no other trace, whose coins were melted down, whose inscriptions were destroyed, and whose brief moment of power was too fleeting to register in any source that survived independently. This is the trap the Historia Augusta sets for its readers. Dismiss everything that cannot be independently confirmed, and you risk discarding real historical information that happens to survive in only one source, a situation that is, in ancient history, far more common than not. Accept everything the text says, and you risk incorporating fiction into the historical record, treating invented characters as real people and fabricated documents as genuine evidence. The text demands a level of source criticism so fine-grained, so judgment-dependent, that two equally qualified scholars can examine the same passage and reach opposite conclusions about its reliability. And this raises a question that goes beyond the Historia Augusta itself. If a single ancient text can introduce fictional emperors into the historical record so convincingly that scholars debate their existence 16 centuries later, how many other ancient texts, now lost, might have done the same thing? The Historia Augusta is unusual, not because it mixes fact and fiction, but because it survived long enough for modern scholars to catch it doing so. Other late Roman historical works, now lost, may have contained similar inventions. Fictional usurpers, imaginary battles, fabricated treaties that were incorporated into later histories without anyone ever questioning their authenticity. The anonymous author, whoever he was, clearly had access to genuine historical sources, some of which are now lost. Embedded within the fabrications and literary games are details that match evidence from inscriptions, coins, and papyri discovered centuries after the Historia Augusta was written. Details the author could not have invented, because the confirming evidence was buried underground at the time. This means the text is not purely fictional. It is a mixture, and the proportions of the mixture are unknown. Some passages transmit real information from real sources that no longer exist. Other passages are inventions, crafted with enough skill to be indistinguishable from the genuine material that surrounds them. Why would someone do this? The author's motives have been debated as intensely as the content itself. Some scholars have proposed that the work is essentially a satire, a literary joke aimed at readers sophisticated enough to recognize the fabrications and appreciate the craft behind them. Others have argued that it was a political document using the cover of imperial biography to comment on contemporary events in the late 4th century, embedding criticisms and arguments in the lives of long-dead emperors where they could circulate without attracting direct censorship. Still others have suggested that the author was simply a mediocre historian with poor sources and a tendency to fill gaps with imagination. Not a deliberate deceiver, but a careless one, producing work that was never intended to withstand the level of scrutiny it would eventually receive. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. The text is too clever for carelessness, too detailed for pure satire, and too inconsistent for a coherent political program. It resists categorization in the same way it resists verification, always offering just enough truth to keep the reader engaged, and just enough falsehood to keep the reader uncertain. The manuscripts sit in European libraries today, copied, edited, annotated, translated into a dozen languages, and still, after all of that, not fully understood. Somewhere in their pages, real emperors share space with phantoms. Real documents are quoted alongside inventions, and the single anonymous author who created this hall of mirrors, who knew exactly what was real and what was not, who held in his mind the key that would have unlocked every fabrication and confirmed every truth, took that knowledge with him when he died, leaving behind a text that has been read continuously for 16 centuries and that still, on every page, dares its readers to decide what they believe.